across the endless expanse of the Pacific, where the ocean meets the horizon in eternal silence, lies a land unlike any other, a remote speck of volcanic rock known to its people as Rapa Nui. Here, hundreds of colossal faces gaze toward the heavens, carved from ancient stone, their expressions frozen in timeless watchfulness. These are the Moai, guardians of mystery, witnesses to a forgotten age. Each one stands as if bearing a secret, whispering of a civilization that rose in isolation then fell into shadow. For centuries, explorers, scholars, and dreamers have asked the same haunting question: who truly built them? Were they the work of an advanced lost culture, remnants of a deeper human past now erased by time? Or do they speak of something more spiritual, an ancient communion between humankind and the gods of creation? Tonight, we journey beyond the myths and into the stone itself, tracing the hidden story of the Moai and the people who dared to shape giants from the bones of their island. Welcome to the enduring enigma of who really built the giant statues of Easter Island. Chapter 1. Rapa Nui, the island at the edge of the world rising from the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Rapa Nui is a place that feels more imagined than real, a triangle of volcanic earth adrift in isolation. It sits nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore, a pinprick of land surrounded by an ocean that swallows all direction. To stand upon its soil is to stand at the world's edge, where the horizon folds into eternity and the past feels nearer than the present. The island measures only 163 square kilometers, yet every inch seems steeped in myth. On its windswept slopes stand the Moai, colossal stone figures, each with elongated faces and heavy brows, gazing inward toward the island's heart. They rise in silent ranks from the earth half buried, their bodies cloaked in centuries of volcanic dust. To many who first encountered them, these statues seemed less like creations of human hands and more like remnants of a forgotten race of giants. When the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday of 1722, he wrote of a land filled with idols, some rising higher than the tallest ships. The sight astonished his crew. They found a people few in number, living among ruins whose scale and age defied explanation. To European eyes, the question was immediate: who built these titans, and what fate had befallen their civilization? Centuries later, that question still lingers, suspended between archaeology and legend. Rapa Nui, known to its inhabitants as Te Pito or Tehenua, the navel of the world, was not always so silent. Beneath the dry grasses that ripple across its hills lie the remnants of once thriving villages, stone foundations of homes called Hairpianga shaped like overturned canoes. Along the island's coastline, ancient platforms called Ahu stretched toward the sea, sacred altars upon which the Moai were raised, their backs turned to the ocean as if guarding the living from unseen spirits. The Moai themselves, more than 800 in total, were carved from the volcanic tuff of Rano Kau, an extinct crater that served as both quarry and workshop. Here, hundreds of unfinished statues remain embedded in the slopes, some still attached to the rock as if abandoned mid-creation. Archaeologists like Thor Heyerdahl, who arrived in the 1950s, described the quarry as a frozen industry, a moment in time arrested by some unknown catastrophe. Yet, even before the island had already become a riddle to historians. How had a small, isolated population managed to carve, transport, and erect figures weighing up to 80 tons without metal tools, draft animals, or wheels? Early theories veered toward the fantastical suggestions of lost continents, vanished civilizations, or visitors from the stars. But beneath the mythic haze lies a far older story, one rooted in the audacity of human navigation. Modern archaeology points to the great Polynesian migrations, an age when voyagers set sail across thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but the stars, the wind, and the motion of the waves. From Samoa to the Marquesas, from Tahiti to Hawaii, these navigators carried with them languages, crops, and gods. It is believed that one such voyage, perhaps around 1200 CE, reached Rapa Nui, but here the certainty falters. Radiocarbon analysis from charcoal and obsidian fragments, unearthed in the island's earliest habitation sites, has suggested dates as early as 800 CE, a discrepancy that challenges the accepted timeline. Some argue that small groups may have reached the island centuries earlier, only for their traces to vanish under later layers of settlement. Others believe the radiocarbon results reflect contamination from ancient fires or volcanic activity. As with so many chapters of Rapa Nui's history, the evidence is both precise and elusive, always pointing towards something just out of reach. Still, the Polynesian connection remains undeniable. Linguistic parallels between Rapa Nui's native tongue and those of eastern Polynesia, especially Mangaravan and Marquesan, reveal a shared ancestry. The oral traditions tell of a founding king, Hatumatua, who arrived with his people in double-hulled canoes, guided by sacred signs and visions. They brought with them the sweet potato, chickens, and the memory of ancestral gods, the first breath of culture on an empty island. For generations, the people of Rapa Nui thrived. They cultivated taro and yams, fished the surrounding waters, and erected their moai as embodiments of lineage and spiritual power. Each statue represented a deified ancestor, believed to watch over the clan and ensure fertility of land and life. As centuries passed, the statues grew larger, their craftsmanship more refined. The island transformed into an open-air cathedral of stone. But isolation, the same force that preserved Rapa Nui's mystery, also sowed the seeds of its decline. By the time European ships appeared on the horizon, the island's forests were gone, its once verdant palm groves reduced to grassland. Without trees, canoes could no longer be built, and birds that once filled the skies had disappeared. What caused this ecological collapse remains a point of fierce debate. Some archaeologists point to overexploitation, a society that grew beyond the limits of its fragile ecosystem. Others suggest climate fluctuations or the introduction of the Polynesian rat, which devoured the seeds of the island's palm trees. Yet even these explanations feel incomplete. Oral legends speak of civil strife, of rival clans toppling each other's moai in acts of vengeance, of spiritual balance shattered. It is as though the island itself had turned against its people. In the 1990s, excavations led by Joanne van Tilburg and the Easter Island Statue Project revealed something astonishing. The moai, long assumed to be mere heads, were in fact complete bodies, some buried up to their shoulders in centuries of sediment, carved with intricate petroglyphs and symbols. These buried sections hinted at ceremonial purposes long forgotten. The discovery reframed the island's narrative. The statues were not toppled relics of failure, but the remnants of a complex spiritual dialogue between earth, ancestors, and sky. Even so, Rapa Nui remains a mirror for human ambition. It reflects our capacity to dream beyond the possible, and our fragility when isolation turns inward. The first explorers saw a civilization in ruins. The archaeologists who followed saw a culture that had transformed, not disappeared. For the Rapa Nui people who live there still, the island is alive, a living ancestor whose silence speaks volumes. In recent decades, new evidence has added further depth to the enigma. DNA studies published in the early 2010s revealed traces of Native American ancestry within the island's population, suggesting that contact between Polynesians and South Americans may have occurred centuries before European arrival. This aligns with oral accounts of long-distance voyages, stories of travelers who sailed eastward toward a land of sweet potatoes, the crop known locally as kumara, whose very name matches that used across the Andes. If true, such contact would mean that the people of Rapa Nui, these masters of navigation, may have bridged the vastest ocean barrier on Earth, connecting to worlds long thought separate. Yet the archaeological record offers only whispers. A few ancient chicken bones found on the Chilean coast, sweet potato starch on Polynesian tools, genetic echoes carried in the blood of descendants. Each fragment beckons us toward a possibility just beyond confirmation. Standing before the moai today, one feels both the weight of time and its collapse. The air hums with quiet, and the wind off the Pacific carries the scent of salt and stone. In that silence, the mind drifts between eras, imagining the quarry fires at Rongorongo, the rhythmic chants of workers hauling stone along log rollers, the ceremonies that consecrated each ahu as the sun bled into the horizon. The island endures, but its history remains half-buried, like the statues themselves. Beneath every layer of discovery lies another, older question. How much of Rapa Nui's past has been erased, and by whom? Colonial records from the 19th century tell of slave raids that decimated the population, of missionaries who burned sacred tablets inscribed with Rongorongo, the island's undeciphered script. What those glyphs contained, songs, genealogies, maps of the stars, may never be known. Their absence is a wound that refuses to close. Chapter 2. The First Footprints, Polynesian Settlement and the Navigator's Legacy. There is an old saying among the oceanic peoples of the Pacific: the sea is not what separates us, but what connects us. In the stillness of that vast blue expanse, before compasses or charts, human hands and human eyes learned to read the ocean as if it were a living manuscript. And from that manuscript, they traced the greatest voyaging story in prehistory, a story that would end on the lonely cliffs of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, thousands of kilometers from any other shore. When the first canoes appeared on the horizon, this place was untouched by human hands, a world of volcanic stone and seabirds, shaped by wind and isolation. Polynesian oral tradition names their leader Hatu Matua, the ancestral founder who brought his people here from a distant homeland called Heva. The stories vary in tone. Some say he fled a sinking island, others, a war among chieftains, but all agree on one truth, that he and his followers crossed the unbroken ocean guided only by the stars, the waves, and a memory of direction carried in the bones of their navigators. Archaeological traces confirm what the stories whisper. Beneath layers of volcanic soil and weathered grass, scientists have uncovered hearths lined with fire-cracked stones, shards of obsidian tools glinting in the dust, and the fragile bones of Polynesian chickens, the unmistakable signature of early settlement. Radiocarbon dating places their arrival somewhere between 1200 and 1250 CE. Though some evidence suggests earlier landfalls, the world they built here, isolated, yet intricately organized, stands. As one of humanity's most remarkable feats of navigation and adaptation, across the Pacific, the Polynesians had already achieved what no other culture had before, a maritime network stretching from Samoa to Hawaii, from Tonga to Aotearoa, and eastward to the very edge of the known world. Their double-hulled canoes, known as waka or vaka, were not crude vessels but complex instruments of exploration capable of carrying entire families, livestock, and crops across thousands of miles of open sea. The navigators, trained through oral transmission and sacred apprenticeship, read the ocean like a map. They watched how swells bent around unseen islands, traced the flight of migratory birds, memorized the seasonal patterns of the stars, and sensed the subtlest changes in wind and light for centuries. Western scholars doubted that such voyages were possible, assuming the Pacific had been settled by accident, by canoes blown adrift. But the rebirth of traditional navigation in the 20th century, through projects like the Hokula voyages led by Micronesian master navigator Mo Pialog, silenced that skepticism. The ancient methods worked. These were not lost drifters, they were scientists of the sea. Yet, even with such mastery, Rapa Nui remains an enigma. It lies over 3,500 kilometers west of South America, and more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest Polynesian island, Pitcairn. The navigators who reached it did so without metal, without written charts, and without any certainty that land existed at all. To set course for Rapa Nui was an act of both faith and science, an intersection of empirical skill and spiritual conviction. The oral histories speak of 2 large canoes arriving first, carrying clans, crops, and the knowledge of stonework. Each family line took a portion of the island, establishing a system of marta or kin-based territories that would endure for centuries. The settlers brought taro, yams, sugarcane, and chickens, the same suite of domesticates that marked Polynesian migrations elsewhere. But what they found on Rapa Nui was different. There were no streams, few trees, and soils thin from volcanic origin. To survive, they would have to transform the landscape itself. Archaeological digs in the island's interior reveal the fingerprints of that transformation. Ancient gardens of rock mulch, fields of broken basalt stones, were used to trap moisture and shield plants from wind. This method, known as manavai, turned barren land into fertile microclimates. The early Rapa Nui people engineered sustainability from scarcity, carving life out of stone. But perhaps the most haunting evidence of their ingenuity stands not in their fields, but along the island's coasts, the ahu or ceremonial platforms, crowned with the massive statues known as moai. Though later centuries would see the moai grow to towering heights, their earliest forms were smaller, simpler, perhaps the carved likenesses of the first ancestors, raised to watch over the new land. Archaeologists have identified early quarries near Raraku where these prototypes were hewn directly from volcanic tuff. The technology, though rooted in Polynesian stonework, shows sudden leaps in scale and precision that suggests innovation unique to Rapa Nui itself. Some scholars have asked, could this monumental ambition have come from outside influence? The question is delicate, shadowed by the controversies of earlier centuries. European theorists once claimed, without evidence, that such works must have come from South American builders, or even lost civilizations like the Incas. But the genetic and linguistic record speaks otherwise. DNA studies published in the early 2000s and refined in 2020 confirm that the earliest settlers were unmistakably Polynesian. Their language, Rapa Nui, still carries deep cognates with other Polynesian tongues, especially Marquesan and Mangarevan, though its later evolution took on strikingly unique forms. Yet mystery persists. In the midst of that linguistic tapestry lies Rongorongo, a script carved into wooden tablets. Discovered only after European contact in the 19th century, no other Polynesian culture produced a comparable writing system. Its glyphs, looping human figures, plants, birds, and geometric patterns, suggest an independent evolution of literacy, perhaps tied to ritual or astronomical record-keeping. Some linguists suspect it may have emerged late, influenced by European symbols. Others believe it represents a much older native system, erased by colonization and missionary suppression. Today, Rongorongo remains undeciphered, its language silenced, its meaning adrift. The cultural divergence of Rapa Nui, then, might be seen not as an inheritance from outsiders, but as the inevitable flowering of isolation. Cut off from the Polynesian world, the settlers became something new, an island civilization that remembered the ocean only in its myths, while turning inward to master stone, soil, and spirit. At the center of that inward gaze stood the cult of the Tangata Manu, the Birdman. Long after the era of the Moai, this strange ritual arose, a competition of strength and faith centered on the island's sacred crater of Rano Kau. Each year, chosen champions would scale sheer cliffs, swim across shark-infested waters to the islet of Motu Nui, and retrieve the first egg of the Manu Terra, the sooty tern. The man who succeeded would be crowned the Birdman, not a king, but a living vessel of divine power. Scholars trace this cult's emergence to around the 16th or 17th century, a period of ecological strain and social upheaval. It marked a profound shift from reverence for stone ancestors to worship of the living moment. the cycle of rebirth, and the fragile balance between life and land. Through each of these transformations, echoes of the original voyages remained. The Polynesian heritage endured in the structure of kinship, the rhythm of chants, and the unbroken thread of oral memory. Even the Moai, though now silent, half-buried, were once embodiments of the same ancestral veneration that guided canoes across the Pacific. To carve a Moai was to anchor memory in matter, to fix a lineage against the endless drift of time. Modern archaeology continues to peel back layers of this story. Excavations near Anakina Beach, believed to be the site of Hatumatu's first landing, have uncovered post holes from ancient houses, finely crafted adzes, and traces of imported Polynesian vegetation. The alignment of early ceremonial sites suggests a deliberate orientation to the solstices, a celestial memory of the navigator's sky. Here, astronomy and agriculture merged. The cosmos became the calendar of survival. And yet, every discovery seems to deepen the mystery. The question remains, how did those first voyagers find this remote triangle of volcanic earth in the vastness of the Pacific? The modern mind seeks data, currents, trade winds, probability. But to the ancient navigator, it may not have been a question of chance at all. They followed pathways invisible to maps, but etched in the living body of the sea, pathways remembered in chant and dream, in the motion of stars across the dark. Perhaps they did not find Rapa Nui in the modern sense. Perhaps it was always part of a cosmic geography they already knew, a destination encoded not in coordinates, but in belief. When we look at the island today, with its eroded Moai and whispering cliffs, we are standing at the endpoint of humanity's longest road, a road that began when someone first pushed a canoe beyond the sight of land and did not turn back. The footprints they left behind are faint, scattered among obsidian shards and the bones of chickens, but through them, a larger memory endures, the memory of a people who made the ocean their home, and in doing so reached the end of the world, and beyond that end lies another beginning. The sea waits, patient and eternal, holding its secrets beneath the swells, as if remembering the first canoes that cut across its skin, carrying the first dreamers toward a land they could not yet imagine. Chapter 3: The Volcanic Quarries of Raraku, a quiet wound in the earth, where wind moves softly over the slopes of an extinct volcano. Here, amid the whispering grasses of Easter Island, the mountain itself seems to remember what humanity has forgotten. The quarry lies on the island's southeastern flank, a cratered heart of compressed volcanic ash known as tuff. This soft, workable stone was once the flesh of the volcano, and it was from this living surface that the ancient Rapa Nui carved the most haunting icons of their world, the Moai. Nearly all of the island's statues, close to 1,000, were born here, in these slopes. Many still lie half-buried, their elongated faces staring skyward, their bodies still tethered to the earth that conceived them. To walk through Raraku is to enter a landscape that feels both sacred and unfinished, as if time itself grew weary and simply stopped. The ground is uneven with fragments of history. Some Moai remain partially carved into the bedrock, frozen in the very act of emergence, while others were completed but never moved, their colossal forms abandoned in orderly silence. Archaeologists have counted more than 400 statues scattered around the quarry, each one a paused heartbeat in a vanished rhythm of creation. For centuries, the wind and rain have worn their surfaces smooth, erasing the touch of the chisel, but the intent of the sculptors still lingers. The statues vary in size, some modest at 2 or 3 meters, others towering more than 10. The largest, known as El Gigante, measures over 21 meters from crown to base and weighs an estimated 270 tons. It was never freed from the rock. The sculptors had begun, but something, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps calamity, brought their labor to an abrupt halt. To understand Raraku is to stand inside a paradox. The quarry is both a workshop and a graveyard, both the origin and the end of a civilization's grand endeavor. The volcanic tuff of Raraku is unlike any other stone on the island. It is porous and relatively soft, allowing carvers to shape it with basalt picks and chisels. Archaeological studies have found tools scattered around the site, hand-sized basalt, fragments chipped and worn from years of use. Chemical analysis links many of these tools to another quarry miles away, meaning the Rapa Nui brought their implements from distant ridges to work this sacred mountain. The carving process was a feat of patience. First, the outline of a Moai was etched into the surface of the slope, the front face sculpted while the statue's back remained fused to the bedrock. This anchoring allowed the carvers to shape the figure with stability, cutting downward, centimeter by centimeter, following the imagined contours of eyes, nose, and lips. When the front was complete, the sculptors carefully chiseled beneath the statue to release it from the mountain's body. But this was only the beginning. Once freed, the statues, some weighing more than a modern truck, had to be transported across the island's rough terrain to their final destinations, often several kilometers away. There they would be raised onto ceremonial platforms known as Ahu, facing inland toward the people. For generations, this mystery how a small, isolated community managed to move such immense monoliths without wheels, metal, or beasts of burden has captivated explorers and scientists alike. Early European visitors speculated that the islanders must have possessed some long-lost technology, perhaps even divine assistance. In the 19th century, fanciful theories arose of levitation, of alien intervention, of powers forgotten by modern man. But in recent decades, experimental archaeology has offered more grounded, if no less awe-inspiring answers. In 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo conducted one of the most remarkable experiments in Polynesian studies. They proposed that the Moai were not dragged or rolled horizontally, as many had believed, but walked upright, rocked from side to side by coordinated teams using ropes. Their team constructed a replica statue, nearly 3 meters tall and weighing 5 tons, modeled closely on original Moai dimensions. With 3 groups of volunteers pulling in rhythm, the statue began to sway forward, step by step, its curved base allowing it to pivot with surprising grace. In the gathering dusk, the figure appeared almost alive, a stone giant striding through time. This experiment, and others like it, suggest that the Rapa Nui engineered their statues with subtle curvature, anticipating the balance needed to move them upright. It was not brute force, but rhythm and knowledge, a choreography passed down through generations of carvers and movers. Yet this explanation, elegant as it is, cannot account for every mystery. Some of the largest statues, far exceeding 50 tons, would have demanded impossible coordination over treacherous ground. Others appear to have broken en route, left toppled in valleys, as if abandoned mid. Still, the walking theory restores something vital, a sense of humanity to the achievement. It transforms the Moai from symbols of lost magic into monuments of perseverance, carved and moved through the ingenuity of human hands and collective faith. Archaeologists believe Raraku functioned as more than a quarry. It was a sacred center, a place of creation and communion. The volcano's crater contains a freshwater lake, its surface often shrouded in mist. Around it stand statues in various stages of completion, as if guarding the threshold between worlds. Many scholars suggest that the quarry was considered the womb of the island, the place where the ancestors were born from stone before being carried to their resting places. This idea is not merely poetic. In the Rapa Nui language, Moai means to stand or statue, but in deeper oral tradition, the statues were embodiments of monospiritual power inherited from ancestors. Each carving then was more than an image, it was a vessel. The Rapa Nui believed that when the Moai were raised upon their platforms, their eyes made from coral and red scoria would awaken, channeling ancestral energy to bless the living community. In this light, Raraku was not a factory but a temple, a place where the dead were given form to walk once more among the living. Yet something changed. Archaeological layers show that carving activity ceased abruptly. The tools were left where they fell. Some Moai, half-finished, were never detached from the rock. Others were abandoned mid-transport, lying face down along ancient roads. Why? One theory points to ecological collapse. By the 1600s, deforestation had stripped much of the island of trees, depriving carvers of timber for rollers, ropes, and canoes. Without wood, both transportation and daily life would have become impossible. The social structure built around statue building may have disintegrated, leaving Raraku to fall silent. Another theory speaks of conflict. Oral traditions describe a time of division known as the Hoary Moai period, when rival clans toppled each other's statues in acts of vengeance. The quarry, once a sacred source of unity, might have become a casualty of political and spiritual breakdown. There are even suggestions of outside influence, European arrival, disease, or forced labor, all contributing to the unraveling of a fragile system. But perhaps the most haunting explanation lies beyond material cause. Perhaps the people simply stopped believing when faith wanes. So too does the hand that carves today. As archaeologists brush away the soil from long-buried statues, they find that many are not merely heads but full bodies etched with intricate petroglyphs and symbols. Beneath the earth, these giants have been preserved like seeds in the dark, waiting. Carbon dating and soil analysis reveal that the statues have slowly sunk over centuries, their lower halves entombed by erosion and time. Their hidden torsos are inscribed with motifs of birds, waves, and geometric patterns, remnants of a language still only partly understood. To stand at Raraku today is to witness the echo of an unfinished sentence. The mountain is both scar and scripture, each statue a syllable in a story. The earth is still whispering. The air carries the faint smell of volcanic dust. The wind hums through the hollow craters. 1,000 silent faces gaze toward the sky, as if waiting for a command that will never come. Here, the Rapa Nui shaped gods from stone and then left them behind. The reasons remain, scattered like the basalt chips around their feet, fragments of a larger design we can only guess at. Perhaps the mountain took back what was hers. Perhaps the carvers listened to something we no longer hear in the stillness of Raraku. Creation and abandonment are one and the same. The statues sleep, half-born, half-buried, their eyes forever uncut. And as the sun falls behind the crater's rim, the land seems to breathe again, quietly reminding us that some stories do not end. They simply turn to stone and wait. Chapter 4. Moai, the faces of the ancestors beneath the relentless winds of the South Pacific. On a small island adrift in endless blue, The Moai stand in silence, their stone faces weathered, solemn, and enigmatic emerge from the volcanic earth like ancient sentinels. Each one bears the mark of a vanished people, carved not merely as statues, but as vessels of spirit, of ancestry, of something far greater than stone. Rapa Nui, known to the outside world as Easter Island, is one of Earth's most isolated inhabited places, over 2,000 miles separated from the nearest continental shore. Yet it is here, in this wind-swept isolation, that an extraordinary civilization once thrived, building and erecting nearly 900 monumental figures across its landscape. The Moai were their legacy, and through them, the people of Rapa Nui sought to speak to eternity. Each Moai was carved from the tuff, a soft volcanic stone quarried from the slopes of Raraku, the so-called nursery of the giants. The crater walls still bear the ghostly forms of unfinished statues, hundreds of them, half emerged from the living rock, as though frozen in the act of rising. Some are small enough to stand within a hut. Others tower more than 10 meters high, weighing up to 80 tons. Every one was hewn using only basalt tools, stone against stone, over months or even years of devotion. But the Moai were not art for art's sake. To the Rapa Nui, they were Aringa or Ratha, living faces of the ancestors. Each represented a deified lineage head, an ancestral chief whose mana, or spiritual force, could protect and bless the community. The belief was simple yet profound. By carving the likeness of the dead, by erecting it and gazing upon it, one ensured the presence of that ancestor among the living. The Moai were conduits through which the invisible became visible, an unbroken chain binding the present to a sacred past. Curiously, nearly all the Moai face inland, their backs to the sea. They do not watch the horizon or the arriving ships of distant ages. Instead, they gaze over the villages, the fields, and the hearts of their descendants. Their eyes, once inlaid with white coral and red scoria pupils, would have gleamed in the sunlight, casting a living gaze upon the land. Only 7, the Moai of Ahu Akivi, faced outward toward the ocean. Tradition says these represent the 7 explorers sent by the island's first king Hatuma to discover Rapa Nui itself. When archaeologists first arrived in the 19th century, they saw only the heads' great stone faces half buried by time. It seemed as if the island had been filled with decapitated monuments. But later excavations revealed something astonishing. Most Moai possess full bodies carved with arms, hands, and intricate tattoos of sacred symbolism. Over centuries, wind-driven soil had accumulated around them, concealing their lower forms. When the earth was gently removed, archaeologists discovered carvings on their backs, petroglyphs depicting birds, crescent shapes, and the komari, a fertility symbol linked to the island's ancient rites. Some bore designs echoing celestial forms, the sun, the moon, the stars, suggesting a cosmic dimension to their creation. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from the work of the Easter Island Statue Project, led by Jo-Ann van Tilburg in the early 2000s. Her team excavated two Moai still standing in Raraku's slopes. Beneath the soil, they uncovered engravings that seemed almost ceremonial, glyphs of canoe paddles, possibly signifying voyaging or authority, and subtle references to the Birdman cult that rose later in Rapa Nui's history. It was a revelation that the Moai were not static relics, but living objects with evolving meaning. The question then arises, how were these immense figures moved from the quarry to the distant platforms known as Ahu, scattered around the island's perimeter? Theories have shifted over the years, each as intriguing as the last. Early scholars believed they were laid on wooden sleds and dragged, an explanation that implied vast deforestation. Later, experiments suggested that the statues could walk rocked from side to side with ropes and coordinated teams, a method demonstrated successfully in the 2010s by archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. Oral traditions even describe the statues moving themselves, animated by spiritual power, guided by chants and incantations. In that sense, perhaps both science and legend point toward a single truth. Movement itself was a sacred act, a ritual of resurrection and alignment. Atop many Moai once rested a red stone topknot, or pukao, carved from the lighter scoria found at Punapo Quarry. These cylindrical crowns symbolized the chieftain's hair tied in a knot, an emblem of rank and vitality. When viewed from a distance, the red stone glowed under the sun, contrasting with the grey tuff of the body, a living fusion of earth and fire, status and spirit. Yet, for all their grandeur, the Moai are also monuments of silence. Many were left unfinished, some toppled violently, others weathered beyond recognition. The cause remains a matter of debate and mystery. The most common narrative speaks of ecological collapse, forests cut down to move statues, leading to famine, conflict, and the fall of the old order. Others argue this story is too simple, shaped by colonial misunderstanding and moral cautionary tales. Modern research suggests the Rapa Nui adapted with ingenuity, planting gardens within stone enclosures, preserving water, and maintaining culture even amid scarcity. Still, something did change. Around the 17th century, the carving of Moai ceased. The island entered a new spiritual era centered on the Birdman cult, or Tongata. The great stone ancestors were no longer the focus of ritual. Instead, the people turned their attention to the cliffs of Rongorongo, where competitors risked their lives climbing down perilous rock faces to retrieve the first egg of the Manutera. The sacred sooty turn, whoever succeeded gained divine authority for a year. This shift from the static ancestors of stone to the living symbol of the Birdman hints at a transformation in worldview from the fixed gaze of the past to the fleeting cycle of renewal. Some Moai were deliberately toppled during this transition, as rival clans struggled for supremacy. Others may have fallen in earthquakes or through neglect. Whatever the cause, their descent from standing figures to fallen relics marks one of the most haunting transformations in human history, the silent undoing of a sacred landscape. European explorers arrived in 1722, led by Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen. By then, the Moai still stood in great numbers, though the society that built them had already begun to fragment. Later visitors, Spaniards, British, and eventually missionaries found fewer standing statues and more in ruin. Disease, enslavement, and cultural disruption followed swiftly in the wake of contact. By the late 19th century, the Moai stood as the only remaining witnesses of a civilization deliberately eroded by the outside world, and yet, the island endures. In 1955, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl launched an expedition to test the theory that the island had been settled from South America. His ideas stirred fascination, though later genetic and linguistic studies confirmed Polynesian origins. Still, Heyerdahl's work brought global attention to Rapa Nui, and with it, a renewed reverence for the Moai as symbols of human ingenuity and mystery. Modern archaeologists continue to uncover new details. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest Moai construction around the 13th century. Though some oral histories suggest older beginnings, laser scans have revealed precise alignment of certain statues with solstitial points, hinting that they may have functioned as astronomical markers as well as ancestral icons. The island's topography itself seems to form a ritual map, Ahu oriented toward a different sacred feature, such as freshwater sources or volcanic peaks. Even today, the Moai resists final interpretation. They embody both the material and the metaphysical. To stand before one is to feel a presence, something vast, patient, and unspoken. The wind moves across the plains, carrying whispers from centuries ago, the voices of carvers, of priests, of mothers watching fires burn at twilight. The statues remain as memory-solidified faces not of gods, but of those who once dared to carve eternity into stone. In recent decades, restoration projects have raised several fallen Moai, returning them to their platforms. Yet there is an unease that accompanies such renewal. Are we reviving the sacred, or merely reconstructing fragments of a mystery we no longer understand? The Moai, silent as ever, offer no answer. Each face, though carved in stone, seems to change with the light, serene at dawn, mournful by dusk. Their eyes, though long emptied of coral and shell, still seem to watch. Perhaps that is the essence of their power, not what they reveal, but what they conceal. And so the Moai remain the enduring guardians of Rapa Nui, their expressions carved with purpose, their backs marked with stories buried for centuries. They are witnesses to both devotion and downfall, to faith and forgetting. Their stillness is deceptive. Beneath it lies the pulse of a civilization that once spoke to the sky through stone. As night falls across the island, shadows stretch from their chins across the earth. The stars emerge, the same stars that the ancient navigators once followed to find this lonely world. Somewhere between those constellations and the silent faces below lingers a question too vast for words. What memory were they truly meant to hold? And who, in the end, were they watching for? Chapter 5. The Platforms of Power. Ahu Construction. Beneath the shadow of Rapa Nui's silent sentinels, the Moai lie their true foundations, vast ceremonial stages of stone called Ahu. To the untrained eye, these platforms might appear as mere bases, simple supports for the towering figures that define Easter Island's mythic skyline. But to those who study them closely, they reveal something deeper, a geometry of power, ritual, and celestial order that once bound earth and sky together in a harmony, now fractured by time. Each Ahu is a monument in its own right. The most renowned Ahu Tongariki stretches across more than 200 meters of windswept coastline. 15 Moai stand upon it, their backs to the Pacific, their faces turned inward toward the island's heart, as if forever watching over the descendants of those who built them. The platform itself is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. Basalt slabs precisely fitted without mortar, layered upon foundations of coral, ash, and compacted earth. When archaeologists drilled core samples from its depths, they found evidence of deliberate stratification, each layer chosen for resilience, drainage, and stability. It was not trial and error. It was science ritualized. The construction of an Ahu began not with stone but with ceremony. Oral histories speak of priestly navigators, the Tongatamanu, who read the stars and tides before selecting the site of a new platform. The land was first consecrated, its contours mapped in accordance with celestial paths. Then, teams of workers quarried volcanic rock, red scoria from Punapo, dark basalt from Raraku, and white coral from the reefs, each color carrying a symbolic charge: red for vitality, black for ancestral strength, white for purity and light. To build an Ahu was to construct a cosmic order in miniature. The platform's retaining walls were laid with a subtle inward slope, locking each stone against its neighbor. The fill beneath was packed with rounded beach stones, forming a resilient cushion against earthquakes and sea spray. Atop this, dressed slabs created a level terrace where the Moai would eventually stand. Facing inland toward the settlements, their gaze aligned with invisible lines of energy, perhaps ancestral, perhaps astronomical. Over time, patterns emerged. Many Ahu are not randomly placed along the coast but oriented toward the rising or setting of the sun at key points in the solar year. Ahu Akivi, one of the few platforms whose Moai face the ocean, is precisely aligned to the sunset of the spring and autumn equinoxes. When the sun dips between the distant hills, its last light strikes the faces of the 7 standing statues, 7 navigators, it is said, who first found the island. Others, such as Ahu Tahai and Ahu Vainapu, exhibit alignments that correspond not only to solar events but to lunar the rare moments when the moon reaches its furthest extremes in the night sky. An 18.5-year cycle few ancient cultures fully tracked. Such precision suggests an advanced observational knowledge of the heavens, one that predates the Western astronomical instruments by centuries. Yet the builders of Rapa Nui had no metal, no wheels, and no written records. Their mathematics were oral, their measurements guided by horizon markers, shadows, and the rhythm of stars. How, then, did they achieve such accuracy? Some archaeologists attribute this mastery to centuries of accumulated observation. Generations of skywatchers may have memorized the risings and settings of stars, calibrating sacred architecture to mirror their motion. Others suggest something older, an inheritance from voyagers who carried with them a blueprint of sacred geometry, encoded in myth and navigation alike. The Polynesian world was one of vast horizons, where navigation by stars and swells was an act of both science and faith. Could the Ahu be the terrestrial echoes of those cosmic roots? Excavations reveal that beneath many platforms lie earlier phases of construction, older foundations buried beneath newer ones. Some appear to have been dismantled and rebuilt multiple times across generations, each renewal marked by subtle shifts in alignment, as if the builders were correcting, perfecting, or reinterpreting the sky's movements. In some layers, coral and volcanic ash intermingle, a mingling of ocean and fire, the 2 primordial forces of Rapa Nui's creation myth. The land itself became a living archive of belief. The stones tell of extraordinary labor. Each Moai, some weighing over 80 tons, had to be transported from the quarries of Raraku to their appointed Ahu, sometimes several kilometers away. But the platform was no passive stage. It was the axis upon which the statue's spiritual purpose depended. Without its Ahu, a Moai was incomplete, unawakened. The platform anchored it to the land of the living, creating a bridge between the earthly and the divine. When the statue was finally raised, the Ahu became the site of ongoing ceremony. Offerings of food, shells, and obsidian blades were placed at its base. Fires burned in front of the Moai, their smoke rising toward the heavens. In some cases, cremation remains have been found within the platform fill, suggesting that the Ahu also served as tombs for high-ranking ancestors. Thus, each platform was both a calendar and a grave, a sanctuary and an observatory, a convergence of science, spirit, and memory. But the age of harmony did not last. Environmental decline and social upheaval began to fracture Rapa Nui's once cohesive ceremonial order. Deforestation stripped the island of its palm forests, eroding the soil and undermining the delicate balance that sustained life. The old rituals continued, but their grandeur diminished. The precision alignments that once tracked the sun and moon grew neglected, buried under shifting sands and political strife. Some Ahu were toppled during clan wars, their Moai cast down as rivals sought to sever the link between enemies and their ancestors. When European ships first arrived in the early 18th century, they encountered a landscape of ruins, platforms cracked and overgrown, statues broken or half buried. To the visitors, these were relics of a fallen civilization, evidence of primitive excess. But beneath that colonial misreading lies another story, one of intentional silence, of sacred technology misunderstood. Modern restorations, like the monumental effort to rebuild Ahu Tongariki in the 1990s after a devastating tsunami, reveal not just the scale of the ancient architecture but its enduring resilience. Engineers found that even after centuries of neglect, the foundational stones had not shifted. The interlocking basalt, unbound by mortar, absorbed the shock of waves and time alike. It was as if the builders had understood something about balance, not just structural but cosmic. And yet, questions remain. Why do some Ahu align perfectly with solar events, while others deviate slightly as though marking a different cycle, a different cosmology? Were these discrepancies errors, or intentional calibrations to a lunar calendar? Or perhaps even to stellar positions now changed by precession? The alignments whisper of a science bound not to abstract mathematics, but to living observation, a knowledge that ebbed and flowed with generations. A deeper mystery lies in the cultural memory embedded within the platforms themselves. Across Polynesia, from the Maori of Tahiti to the Heiau of Hawaii. We find similar stone platforms serving as ceremonial centers, always coastal, always astronomically oriented. Could the Ahu be part of that wider network, fragments of a shared sacred geometry that once spanned the Pacific? If so, the builders of Rapa Nui were not isolated experimenters, but the inheritors of an oceanic tradition, one that mapped the heavens as carefully as it mapped the sea. Some fringe scholars have gone further, proposing that Rapa Nui's alignments preserve remnants of an even older cartography, a lost global system of Earth energy lines, or telluric currents, once understood by civilizations now vanished. While such claims remain unproven, the precision of the Ahu invites speculation. Why would an isolated island community, living on one of the most remote corners of the planet, devote generations to building observatories in stone unless they were safeguarding knowledge of cosmic import? What is certain is that each platform was a world unto itself. From its coral base to its basalt crown, an Ahu embodied the relationship between sea, land, and sky, between the living and the dead. The Moai, standing upon their thrones of stone, were not mere idols but focal points of that sacred geometry, channels through which ancestral manna could flow into the world today. The winds still sweep across Ahu Tongariki, carrying the scent of salt and volcanic dust. The Moai gaze inland as they always have, and the stones beneath them, worn but unbroken, continue to bear the weight of mystery. Beneath their surfaces lie traces of forgotten rites, ash from long extinguished fires, coral from vanished reefs. Each layer is a voice, whispering fragments of a story that refuses to end. The platforms of power still hold their secrets. Their alignments point to stars no longer seen as the ancients saw them. Their stones rest upon foundations whose meaning has faded from memory, and yet, in their silence, they speak not of collapse, but of endurance. Perhaps the Ahu were never just monuments to the past, but messages for the future, markers left by a people who understood that the line between heaven and earth is not drawn above us, but beneath our feet. And as the last light of dusk touches the basalt faces of Tongariki, one cannot help but wonder what else lies hidden beneath the stones. The answer, perhaps, waits in the layers yet unturned. Chapter 6. Rongorongo. The forgotten script. There are places in the world where silence feels ancient. Easter Island Rapa Nui is one of them. Its volcanic slopes rise from the Pacific like a monument to endurance, its shores watched over by the solemn faces of the Moai. But beneath these stone gazes lies another enigma, carved not in basalt, but in the fragile grain of wood, a script without a voice, a language without a memory. The islanders call it Rongorongo. Discovered in the late 19th century, Rongorongo remains one of humanity's last undeciphered writings, a message from a culture whose words have been erased, whose speakers fell silent long before the meaning could be preserved. It is a system of glyphs so intricate, so deliberate, that scholars still debate whether it represents true writing or something even more elusive, a bridge between image and utterance, between art and language. The story begins in 1864. A Catholic missionary, Father Eugene Iro, arrived on the island, intent on conversion and record-keeping. In his reports, he mentioned curious wooden tablets kept in the homes of the islanders, flat pieces of driftwood, covered with neat rows of symbols. The people, he said, seemed to handle them with reverence, though few still understood their purpose. When Iro's writings reached Europe, they sparked fascination and disbelief. Could this remote island, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, have invented its own system of writing? By the time European collectors began to seek the tablets, tragedy had already hollowed out Rapa Nui's population. In the decades following first contact, waves of slave raids and disease reduced the island's inhabitants from thousands to barely 100. Much of the old knowledge, rituals, genealogies, oral history was lost in the upheaval, and with it perhaps the key to the script itself. Today, only 24 surviving Rongorongo artifacts are known to exist. They rest in museums and archives scattered across the world in Santiago, London, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Honolulu. Some are tablets, others are staffs, ornaments, or small fragments. All bear the same mysterious patterns, lines of small figures, birds, fish, plants, geometric forms, and anthropomorphic shapes arranged in rows that alternate direction with each line. This style, called reverse boost, requires the reader to turn the object after each line, an elegant dance of text and motion, as if the words were meant to flow like the rhythm of the sea itself. Each glyph was cut with a shark's tooth or obsidian flake, its edges darkened by time and smoke. The wood, often driftwood from distant lands, carried its own journey. Eidenwood, Toromito, sandalwood. It's as if the tablets themselves were migrants, crossing the vast Pacific just as the Rapa Nui once did. What do the glyphs say? That is the question that has haunted linguists and archaeologists for more than a century. Early attempts at decipherment were driven by comparison. Scholars looked for parallels with known scripts, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mayan logograms, even the ancient symbols of the Indus Valley. But none aligned. The figures of Rongorongo do not correspond to phonetic sounds or syllables in any known Polynesian language. They appear instead to be a mixture of ideograms, symbols that convey meaning through imagery and, possibly, representing whole words or names. Some researchers believed the tablets recorded genealogies, tracing the sacred bloodlines of the island's chiefs. Others proposed that they were calendars, recording celestial cycles or ritual observances tied to the movement of the stars. One tablet, known as the Moai tablet, seems to depict a repeating lunar pattern, perhaps linked to the island's old timekeeping system. Yet these are hypotheses built on fragile ground patterns seen in the fog of an unknown grammar. There are those who whispered that the meaning was never meant for outsiders to grasp. When Christian missionaries took hold of the island's spiritual life, they condemned the old beliefs and rituals as heathen remnants. It's said that many tablets were burned, their glyphs vanishing into ash and smoke. Others may have been hidden away, buried beneath volcanic soil or sealed within caves, waiting for an age when they could be read again. Whether these tales are true or not, they mirror a pattern seen across the ancient world, the silencing of a language when its keepers are conquered, its sacred knowledge erased in the name of progress. Modern attempts to decode Rongorongo have been aided by computers, statistical linguistics, and cross-cultural comparison. In the 1990s, researchers like Thomas Barthel and Stephen Fisher catalogued the glyphs, numbering them and mapping their distributions. Patterns began to emerge: pattern sequences, structural rhythm. Fisher proposed that Rongorongo might encode chants, stylized oral recitations that recorded myths and genealogies. Yet his interpretation remains unveiled. No bilingual text exists, no Rosetta Stone to bridge symbol and speech. The mystery deepens when one considers how isolated Rapa Nui truly was. If Rongorongo represents a true writing system, it would stand among the rarest achievements in human history and independent invention of literacy. Only a handful of cultures, Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, and perhaps Egypt, are believed to have developed writing without outside influence. Could a small island in the farthest reaches of the Pacific have done the same? Some argue that the idea of writing might have reached Rapa Nui indirectly, carried by European contact in the early 18th century, Captain Cook's voyages, the arrival of missionaries, or even tales from visiting Polynesian neighbors could have inspired local artisans to experiment with symbolic notation. Yet this explanation feels thin. The complexity and internal consistency of Rongorongo suggests a system that evolved over generations, not a fleeting imitation. Others look farther back. They see echoes between the glyphs and the petroglyphs carved into the island's stone surfaces: spirals, birdman faces, and fertility symbols. These rock carvings predate European contact by centuries. If Rongorongo grew from these ancestral designs, then the script may represent an indigenous continuum, an art that slowly transformed into language. The Birdman figure, for instance, half human, half avian, appears both on the tablets and on the cliffs near Rongorongo, where ritual contests once determined who would lead the island's clans for the coming year. The glyphs may therefore encode mythic or political narratives woven into the island's ritual life, and yet, we do not know. Each attempt at translation faces the same barrier: the silence of context. No one alive remembers how the signs were read. The last individuals said to have knowledge of the old script died in the 19th century, leaving behind only fragments of memory. Some describe the tablets as talking wood, used by chiefs and priests to preserve sacred lore. Others believed they were mnemonic aids, tools for reciting long chants rather than literal texts. Both possibilities could be true writing and recitation intertwined, as they once were in so many ancient traditions. If the glyphs were meant to be sung, then perhaps their meaning was never fixed at all. Perhaps each line represented not words but rhythm and encoded cadence of knowledge, fluid and alive, impossible to capture on paper in the last few decades. Interest in Rongorongo has revived, not only among scholars but among the descendants of the Rapa Nui themselves. Local researchers and artists have begun to reclaim the symbols as part of their cultural heritage. The glyphs appear on fabrics, carvings, and murals, reimagined as living emblems of identity. Even if the literal meaning remains hidden, the script still speaks wordlessly, insistently of continuity and survival. The surviving tablets are fragile. Some have been cracked by time or split by heat. The grooves of the carvings collect dust, their edges fading with every decade. Yet when one looks closely, the lines still shimmer faintly under light, as though retaining the warmth of the hands that once carved them. There is a presence in them beneath the surface. It is possible that the key to Rongorongo lies not in comparing it to other scripts, but in understanding the worldview that birthed it. The people of Rapa Nui saw their island not as isolation, but as a centura navel of the world. In their cosmology, everything was connected: the land, the ancestors, the stars, the sea. Perhaps the tablets were never meant to separate language from life. Perhaps they were meant to preserve a pattern of being, a map of the cosmos rendered in wood and line. And so, the question lingers: was Rongorongo an invention of necessity, a record of power, a prayer, or something older still, a vessel for memory itself? Every attempt to read it is an act of resurrection. Each symbol, each tiny figure carved into drifting timber, is a remnant of a voice that once spoke of gods, of lineage, of time. The ocean has carried away so much of that voice, yet it has not erased it completely. The glyphs remain, waiting for an ear attuned to their silence. The tablets of Rapa Nui whisper of a world that understood language as something sacred, something not merely read, but remembered. And as we gaze upon them, we are reminded that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but heard quietly across the centuries. In the breath between meaning and forgetting, the script sleeps still, waiting beneath the ash of history, beneath the eyes of stone that watch the endless sea. Chapter 7: The Mystery of Rano Kau and the Birdman Cult above the restless Pacific. Where cliffs plunge into churning blue and winds carve songs through volcanic stone, lies the crater of Rano Kau, a vast, emerald bowl filled with reeds and still water. Around its rim stand the ruins of Rongorongo, a ceremonial village perched at the edge of the world. Here, on this precarious lip between land and sea, a new faith once emerged from the ashes of an older one. It was a time when the colossal Moai, the great stone sentinels of Easter Island, had fallen silent. The people, exhausted and fractured, turned their eyes from stone to sky, from ancestor to bird. The Birdman Cult, or Tangata, was born here, half religion, half ritual, a cycle of death and rebirth enacted through flesh and faith. And those centuries have passed since its final ceremony. The rocks still whisper its name. The story begins in the shadow of decline. By the 17th century, Rapa Nui, as the islanders called their home, had undergone an ecological collapse. Centuries of deforestation, overexploitation, and isolation had stripped the island bare. The once mighty trees large enough to transport the Moai had vanished. Soil eroded, crops failed, social order fractured. The great clans that once competed to raise statues now turned to new forms of power, and in this crucible of scarcity, belief adapted. The gods had not vanished, they had changed their faces. Where the old world worshipped ancestors embodied in stone, the new one found divinity in motion, in flight, in the rhythm of wings over the sea. The Manutara, the sacred sooty tern, became the messenger between worlds. Each year it returned to nests on the nearby islets of Motu Nui and Motu Iti, small rocky outcrops just beyond the southwestern cliffs of Rano Kau. With its arrival, a new season began, a season of hope, renewal, and contest. Every year, the island's clans gathered at Rongorongo to witness the Birdman competition, a ritual as perilous as it was sacred. Representatives known as Hopu were chosen by each clan chief to compete for the first egg of the Manutara. The ritual unfolded with the drama of myth. The Hopu would descend the treacherous cliffs of Rano Kau barefoot, carrying provisions bound in reed baskets, and swim through shark-infested waters to the islet of Motu Nui. There, for days or even weeks, they would wait among the rocks for the arrival of the sacred birds. When the first egg was laid, the Hopu who claimed it cried out toward Rongorongo, shouts to the Birdman. His master, the chief he represented, became the Tangata Manu, the Birdman of that year, endowed with divine and political power until the next competition. The Birdman was not merely a leader, he was a living bridge between human and divine. His body became sacred, his voice became prophecy, his head was shaven and painted with red ochre and white chalk, echoing the sacred markings of the gods. He would live in ritual seclusion, attended by priests, embodying the renewal of the world through his chosen status taught to walk through. Rongorongo today is to move through the remnants of this mysterious transformation. Over 50 stone houses, their walls curved and their entrances low and narrow, cluster near the cliff's edge. They seem to grow from the earth itself, built from basalt slabs that curve like shells. Inside, darkness swallows light. The ceilings press low, forcing visitors to bow as if in reverence. Carved into the stones around Rongorongo are hundreds of petroglyphs and sized images of bird-headed men, human figures with outstretched wings, and faces of Make the creator god. The carvings are everywhere, on walls, on doorways, even on boulders overlooking the sea. Some figures carry eggs, others kneel in postures of devotion. Archaeologists have identified more than 1,800 petroglyphs in this area alone. The repetition is hypnotic, as though the act of carving was itself a prayer, a way to hold on to the sacred in a world that seemed to be unraveling. The Birdman cult was not an invention of chaos, it was an evolution. Many scholars see it as a response to the collapse of the Moai tradition, an attempt to channel social energy and spiritual longing into a new form. But others detect something deeper, older, an echo of myths that predated even the first statues. Across Polynesia, birds have long symbolized messengers between realms. In Imbori, Hawaiian, and Tahitian traditions, divine ancestors often descend or ascend as birds. The Polynesian god Tain, associated with light in the heavens, is sometimes depicted as a bird or accompanied by them. Could the Birdman cult be a local resurrection of this ancient symbolism, a reawakening of a mythic order that lay dormant beneath centuries of ancestor worship? The question remains open. The cult of the Birdman may have been both an adaptation born of necessity and a remembrance of something primal, carried across the ocean from older homelands. By the time European explorers arrived in the 18th century, the cult was still active. Captain James Cook's crew, landing on Rapa Nui in 1774, recorded islanders with intricate tattoos, body paint, and chants invoking bird spirits. They noted the petroglyphs at Rongorongo and the islanders' reverence for the Mantara, though the deeper meaning eluded them. But the arrival of outsiders hastened the end. With European contact came disease, enslavement, and forced conversions. By the mid-19th century, missionaries had declared the Birdman rituals pagan and forbidden. The sacred village of Rongorongo was abandoned. The competitions ceased. The last recorded Birdman was crowned in the 1860s. After that, silenced and yet Rano Kau endures. Its crater lake, one of the island's few sources of fresh water, remains still and reflective. Surrounded by slopes of green reeds, the wind moves across the grass like the breath of ghosts. From the rim, one can see the outlines of Rapa Nui, distant and black against the waves. To look from this height is to glimpse time layered upon itself, the Moai age beneath, the Birdman cult above, and the modern world intruding at the edges. Each stratum tells a different story of survival, belief, and transformation. For the Rapa Nui people, the Birdman cult was not a rejection of their past but a reconfiguration of meaning. When the gods of stone could no longer speak, they listened instead to the sky. In recent years, archaeologists and anthropologists have revisited Raraku, using 3D scanning and photogrammetry to preserve its carvings before erosion and time erased them completely. The petroglyphs, once dismissed as superstition, are now recognized as an archiva, visual scripture recording a civilization's spiritual evolution. Each carving holds a fragment of narrative: the arrival of the Manu, the triumph of the Hopu, the coronation of the Birdman, the eternal dance between man, nature, and the divine. Some even speculate that the cult encoded astronomical knowledge, the timing of the competitions coinciding with seasonal cycles, migrations, and celestial alignments. The return of the Manutara may have been seen not only as a biological event but as a cosmic renewal, the sky and sea returning to balance. To stand at Rongorongo at dusk is to feel suspended between worlds. The horizon dissolves into a single line of silver light. The sea below roars in endless repetition. Shadows stretch across the crater, and in that stillness, one can almost imagine the chants of the priests, the call of the seabirds, the splash of swimmers vanishing into the surf. The Birdman is gone, yet his spirit lingers not as a relic of superstition, but as a memory of transformation. The people of Rapa Nui endured catastrophe not by surrendering faith, but by reshaping it. They turned loss into ceremony, scarcity into myth. When the land could no longer sustain the statues, they turned to the sky and made gods of wings. And so, Rano Kau remains a threshold, a place where old gods fade and new ones are born. The Birdman's face, carved in stone and shadow, still watches the ocean, waiting for the return of the sacred birds. Perhaps he waits too for us to remember that even in ruin, belief endures. Chapter 8: The Great Deforestation, Collapse or Transformation. Far out in the Pacific, more than 2,000 kilometers from any continent, lies Rapa Nui, the island the world knows as Easter Island, a place of wind, silence, and memory. Today its slopes are bare, its soil thin and parched, the once green land stripped to grass and scrub. And yet, scattered across this austere landscape stand the colossal Moai solemn stone figures gazing inland, as if in mourning for a vanished world. Their presence raises a haunting question that has divided generations of scholars. What happened here? For decades, the story of Rapa Nui has been told as a parable of ecological ruin, a warning carved into the bones of an island. The conventional narrative is stark, that once this remote speck of land was clothed in a dense palm forest, home to seabirds and fertile soils. Then came human arrival, perhaps around 1200 CE, when Polynesian navigators settled its shores. In the centuries that followed, the settlers cleared the trees for canoes, fuel, and agriculture. As the forests fell, the soil eroded, crops failed, famine and conflict erupted. The Moai, once symbols of unity and power, were toppled in desperation and revolt. The civilization collapsed, consumed by its own excess. It was a story that echoed modern anxieties, a mirror held up to humanity's own self-destructive tendencies. The historian Jared Diamond popularized this view in his book Collapse, calling Rapa Nui the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its own resources. It became an ecological morality tale, the island as a miniature Earth. But like the island itself, the truth is more complex, layered beneath centuries of myth and assumption. Recent research drawn from sediment cores, pollen samples, and archaeological re-evaluation paints a different picture, one less of catastrophe than of slow, adaptive transformation. Deep beneath the island's lakes, cores of ancient sediment preserve the record of its vanished vegetation. Embedded in those layers are the fossilized remains of pollen from the now extinct Rapa Nui palm, a towering species related to the Chilean wine palm. For thousands of years, it formed a lush canopy over the island. Yet the pollen record shows that its decline was gradual, unfolding over centuries, not the sudden devastation of human recklessness, but a slow thinning of the forest. Among the culprits, scientists have found an unexpected accomplice: the Polynesian rat. Likely arriving with the first settlers in their voyaging canoes, these rats thrived in the absence of predators, feeding on the seeds of the palms and preventing their regrowth, even without large-scale human felling. The forest may have been doomed by the quiet, unstoppable appetite of a stowaway species. This revelation reframes the story. Deforestation, in this light, was not an act of ecocide but an ecological chain reaction, one part human, one part unintended consequence. The islanders did cut trees, but they also adapted as their world changed. When timber grew scarce, they turned to stone, creating vast agricultural systems unlike anything else in Polynesia. Across the island, archaeologists have discovered monovised circular rock enclosures that trapped moisture and protected crops from wind. They built lithic mulching gardens, spreading stones across the soil to conserve heat and prevent erosion. Within these engineered landscapes, they cultivated sweet potatoes, taro, and banana crops resilient enough to survive in depleted soil. These were not signs of collapse, but of ingenuity. Oral traditions, too, tell a story not of extinction but of endurance. The island's elders spoke of hardship, yes, but also of adaptation, of new ways of growing food, of reorganizing society around ritual and resource management. The decline of the forest may have transformed Rapa Nui's economy, but not necessarily its spirit. Even the toppling of the Moai, once seen as a symbol of social breakdown, now appears more complex. Archaeological dating suggests that many statues were deliberately laid down, perhaps during ritual changes or shifts in political power, not chaotic warfare. The island's society evolved, adapting to new realities in both faith and form. By the time European explorers first arrived in 1722, Rapa Nui was no wasteland. It was still inhabited, its people cultivating gardens, fishing, and maintaining complex social traditions. What Europeans mistook for ruin may have been the equilibrium of a small society that had learned to live within its limits. The real collapse, the one that truly shattered Rapa Nui, came not from within, but from beyond the horizon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, waves of foreign contact brought disease, enslavement, and colonial disruption. Peruvian slave raids in the 1860s abducted much of the population. Missionaries and foreign powers later imposed new systems of control, dismantling what remained of the island's ancestral culture. By then, the Moai had already fallen silent, but the people's endurance tested for centuries could not withstand the world that arrived by ship. And so, the story of Rapa Nui's collapse may in truth be the story of its survival. A civilization that transformed in the face of ecological change, endured for centuries in balance with scarcity, and only succumbed when the outside world intruded. This perspective changes how we see the Moai themselves. No longer just monuments to hubris or megalomania, they become emblems of continuity, a lineage of memory linking generations through ritual. Each statue was raised to embody an ancestor, to anchor the living to the spiritual landscape. Even as the forests disappeared and crops shifted, the people continued to carve and erect these figures, their faith unbroken. Some researchers suggest that the very act of building Moai and the communal labor it required may have strengthened social cohesion during times of ecological stress. The statues, far from symbols of decadence, may have been instruments of resilience, keeping the islanders united through shared purpose. Seen in this light, Rapa Nui's history is not a warning of self-destruction, but a meditation on adaptation, a lesson in how cultures evolve under constraint. The islanders did not vanish. Their descendants still live on the island today, carrying forward language, songs, and traditions that remember both the forested paradise and the stone-built world that followed. Standing on the slopes of Raraku, the quarry where the Moai were born, the view stretches across a treeless horizon, a landscape stripped bare, yet deeply alive with memory. The wind carries whispers through the empty sockets of unfinished statues, faces half buried in earth, as if listening to the echo of their own story. Perhaps the true transformation of Rapa Nui was not from abundance to ruin, but from wood to stone, from a world of growth to one of endurance. Where forests once stood, the Moai remain, watching still, guardians of a people who learned to survive when the world changed around them. The hills of Rapa Nui hold both versions of the story, collapse and adaptation, ending and renewal. Which one we choose to believe may say less about the island and more about ourselves. Chapter 9. European Contact. First Sightings and Misunderstandings. The year was 1722. Across the vast emptiness of the Pacific, 3 Dutch ships, Afrikansche Galia Rend and Thienhoven, drifted beneath unfamiliar stars. Their commander, Jacob Roggeveen, was searching for the fabled southern continent, a land rumored to balance the world's hemispheres. But what he found on Easter Sunday, April 5th, was something far smaller and infinitely stranger. Through the morning mist, Roggeveen's crew sighted a low island, treeless and remote, its cliffs rising from the sea like the walls of a lost world. They named it Pashaland Easter Island. To its inhabitants, it was Rapa Nui, the navel of the world. What began as an encounter between explorers and islanders would soon become a collision between worlds, one that neither side could fully understand. When Roggeveen and his men first came ashore, they were astonished. The people who greeted them were tall, copper-skinned, and adorned with ornaments of bone and shell. Their faces were tattooed, their ears elongated, their gazes calm and watchful. But what caught the Dutch most off guard were the statues' towering stone figures, hundreds of them, scattered across the landscape like sentinels. To the sailors, they seemed impossible. How could such an isolated island, with no visible trees or beasts of burden, have raised such monoliths? Roggeveen's journal preserves that bewilderment. He described the statues as stone giants, some standing upright, others half buried in earth. He called them the work of a people with imagination but little industry, noting incorrectly that they seemed to serve no purpose. His words, like so many that would follow, reveal more about the European gaze than the island itself. The Dutch could not see what they were looking at. They saw an island stripped of trees and assumed decline, a people they did not understand and assumed primitive. They did not see that the barren soil beneath their boots had once been lush, or that the statues were more than stone. They were ancestors, embodiments of mana, the living force of lineage and memory. Tension arose quickly. The Dutch, wary of ambush, fired muskets when they thought the islanders approached too closely. Several Rapa Nui were killed. It was the first exchange between Europe and this farthest outpost of Polynesian. It began in violence. Within days, the ships departed, leaving behind confusion and grief. Roggeveen carried away his reports and sketches, fragments of a culture already distorted through the lens of distance. Half a century later, in 1770, the island was visited again, this time by a Spanish expedition sent from Peru. They found a people still building, still carving, still remembering. But change had already begun. The Spaniards claimed the island for the crown, raising a cross and forcing the local chiefs to sign an annexation document they could not read. 4 years later, Captain James Cook arrived. His crew noted the same statues, the same solemn faces, but now the air of decay was unmistakable. Some moai lay toppled, villages seemed empty. The great stone quarries were silent. Cook's journal, too, is tinged with misunderstanding. He speculated that the Rapa Nui must have once been more numerous, more industrious, that some ancient civilization had collapsed, leaving behind only relics and ruin. His companion, William Hodges, sketched a landscape with melancholy precision, statues half submerged in earth, fields gone to dust. They did not know that much of the island's hardship had been recent, that European disease and conflict between clans, perhaps worsened by earlier encounters, had already begun to unravel old structures of power. By the time the French explorer La Perouse visited in Iti Balu, the island was already known across European circles as a riddle, a place of giants and fallen idols, a mystery to be solved rather than a culture to be understood. The Polynesian voices, the songs of genealogy and ritual, were absent from these accounts. What remained were guesses and sketches, filtered through foreign tongues. For the Rapa Nui, the centuries that followed were not of discovery, but of loss. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders descended upon the island, seizing more than 1,000 men, women, and children, nearly half the population. They were taken to the guano mines of Peru, forced into labor, and few ever returned. Among those lost were the priests and elders who still remembered the Rongorongo, the island's undeciphered script. When smallpox arrived with the few survivors who were later repatriated, it swept through what remained of the population, erasing lineages of oral history and sacred knowledge. In the wake of these tragedies came missionaries. In 1864, Catholic priests established the first mission on Rapa Nui. Their goal was salvation, but their methods were suppression. The old gods were denounced as demons. The ceremonies around the moai were forbidden. Many statues were deliberately toppled or left to collapse. Where ancestral memory had once been inscribed in stone, the missionaries built churches. Conversion came not through faith alone, but through necessity and exhausted people, seeking protection in a world they no longer recognized. By the late 19th century, the island had been annexed by Chile and transformed into a vast sheep ranch managed by foreign interests. The Rapa Nui were confined to a single village, forbidden to roam the lands their ancestors had once blessed with stone. The rest of the island, its quarries, its platforms, its sacred spaces, became pasture. European explorers continued to arrive, measuring statues, mapping ruins, taking photographs. But the living culture behind those stones was rarely recorded, except as a shadow. In journals and museums, Rapa Nui was frozen in time, an archaeological curiosity, a cautionary tale of isolation and collapse. The European mind, steeped in Enlightenment rationalism, saw the island as a laboratory for decline, a microcosm of hubris, environmental failure, and moral decay. It was easier to imagine that the islanders had destroyed their own world than to confront the devastation wrought by contact, disease, and enslavement. The narrative of self-destruction took hold and endured for centuries, yet beneath that imposed silence, Rapa Nui endured. Families preserved fragments of memory chants, genealogies, fragments of the old language. The missionaries had erased much, but not all. In whispers, the names of ancestors survived. The moai, though fallen, remained sacred. Even toppled, they looked toward the horizon, their gaze unbroken. Modern archaeology has begun to recover what those first European accounts obscured. We now know that the island's deforestation was gradual and complex, driven by both natural factors and the introduction of new species, brought unknowingly by Polynesians themselves, which prevented forest regeneration. The Moai were not monuments to lost kings but living presences, installed as guardians of the land. Their placement followed invisible networks of lineage and water, marking the balance between the physical and spiritual realms. When Roggevin stepped ashore in 1722, he stood at the edge of that world but could not see it. His journals speak of wonder and confusion, but also of blindness, the blindness of one civilization meeting another and mistaking difference for deficiency. What the Europeans recorded was not Rapa Nui as it was, but as they imagined it to be, an island already in decline, a culture already doomed. The irony is profound. The very contact that would devastate Rapa Nui also preserved it in European imagination, a puzzle suspended outside of time. For centuries, scholars and travelers have studied the Moai, debated their origins, and speculated about the island's supposed collapse. But few paused to ask how those who survived understood their own history. Today, descendants of the Rapa Nui continue to reclaim their stories. Their language, once suppressed, is again spoken in schools. Their ceremonies return to the platforms where missionaries once forbade them. And when they speak of the first European ships, they do not tell it as a story of discovery but of interruption. Standing on the cliffs of Rano Kau, where the ocean stretches unbroken to the horizon, one can still imagine that Easter morning in 1722, the sails appearing like ghosts on the edge of the sea, the strangers stepping ashore with wonder and fear. The statues watched them then, as they watch us now, impassive, eternal, witnesses to both awe and forgetting. Rapa Nui was never lost. It was silenced. And even now, beneath the weight of centuries, it waits not for rediscovery, but for understanding. The Moai do not speak. But if they could, perhaps they would tell us that the first misunderstanding was never about gods or statues, but about listening. Chapter 10. Hidden Connections. The Pacific megalithic network across the endless blue of the Pacific. Thousands of islands rise like fragments of a lost world, each one bearing stones that whisper the same story. From the towering Moai of Rapa Nui to the coral platforms of Tonga, from the sacred Ahu of the Marquesas to the Maori of Tahiti, the pattern repeats: raised platforms, aligned stones, ancestral spirits carved into permanence. These are not isolated echoes. They are verses of one great oceanic song, composed across millennia, carried by wind and tide. In the Western imagination, Easter Island stands apart, a cautionary tale of isolation, collapse, and mystery. Yet to those who trace the web of megalithic architecture that spans Polynesia, Rapa Nui is not an exception, but a culmination. Its statues are the most monumental expression of a belief system that once bound the Pacific together. A civilization without borders, whose highways were made of waves. Archaeology has long recognized the Polynesians as master navigators, their ancestors voyaging eastward from the islands of Southeast Asia more than 3,000 years ago, using only the stars, the swells, and the flight of birds. They reached far-flung lands: Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, Hawaii, and finally, Rapa Nui. But beyond their seafaring prowess, the Polynesians built in stone. Everywhere they landed, they raised sacred sites, platforms, terraces, and ceremonial centers, each one a node in a vast spiritual geography. In Tonga, the island of Tonga Tapu is crowned by Ha'amanga, a Maui, a trilithon of coral limestone slabs weighing nearly 40 tons. It stands like a Pacific Stonehenge, aligned with the solstices, its purpose shrouded in legend. Oral tradition calls it the burden of Maui, linking it to the demigod who fished the islands from the sea. Not far away, hundreds of raised tombs, largely constructed of fitted coral blocks, testified to a noble class whose lineage was sanctified in stone. Further east, on the islands of Tahiti and Moria, lie the Mareo Panara temples built from basalt and coral platforms. The Maori Tapatupatia on Raiatea, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was once the religious and political heart of Polynesia. Chiefs and priests from distant islands sailed there to perform rites and renew their ancestral bonds. The stones were not inert, they were imbued with mana, spiritual power connecting people, land, and gods. The geometry of these sites, rectangular platforms, processional pathways, and upright stones, echoes across the Pacific. Each construction, though adapted to local material and culture, shares an underlying grammar. Even on Rapa Nui, the Ahu platforms upon which the Moai stand follow similar alignments, oriented to celestial or oceanic events. This is the architecture of memory, an unbroken lineage of stone linking the farthest horizons of the sea. Yet, the question remains, how could such continuity persist across 10,000 kilometers of ocean, among islands separated by centuries of migration? Was this simply cultural diffusion, shared belief carried eastward by voyaging canoes, or does it hint at something deeper? An ancient maritime network whose reach we still underestimate. Some scholars, including early explorers like Thor Heyerdahl, saw in the Moai and other Pacific monuments signs of pre-Polynesian influence, perhaps even contact with South America. Heyerdahl's Kentucky expedition of 1947, though dismissed by most archaeologists, was inspired by real enigmas, similarities in reed boat traditions, and myths of ancestral arrivals from the East. While his conclusions were flawed, his intuition that the Pacific was once more interconnected than we think still haunts the debate. Modern science has revived this conversation in unexpected ways. In 2020, a groundbreaking genetic study found traces of pre-Columbian Native American ancestry among Polynesian populations, particularly in Rapa Nui and the Marquesas Islands. The DNA markers date to around 1200 CE, centuries before European contact. The finding suggests that Polynesians and Native Americans most likely from coastal South America did meet somewhere across the vast Pacific. How or where such encounters occurred remains unknown. Did Polynesian voyagers reach the coast of South America, trading sweet potatoes and stories before turning back to the open sea? Or did Andean seafarers drift westward, carried by Humboldt currents, reaching the fringes of Polynesia? Either path defies our traditional maps of history, which still struggle to imagine the Pacific as a place of connection rather than isolation. The sweet potato, known across Polynesia as kumara or kumala, provides another tantalizing clue. Genetic analysis shows that the crop originated in the Andes, yet it was cultivated across Polynesia centuries before European arrival. Its very name shares roots with the Quechuan kumara, hinting that both the plant and its story traveled by human hands. The crop spread may mark the trail of those ancient exchanges of botanical footprints of forgotten contact. Stone, however, tells an even deeper story. Across the Pacific, the techniques of megalithic construction show remarkable parallels, not identical, but resonant. The Cyclopean walls of Andean sites like Sacsayhuaman, with their interlocking blocks and seismic precision, seem to find distant cousins in the coral limestone tombs of Tonga or the basalt platforms of the Marquesas. The resemblance could be coincidence or evidence of convergent genius, human ingenuity responding to the same elemental challenge to make memory endure against time and tide in both regions. Stone was more than structure, it was spirit. The Moai of Rapa Nui were not idols, but ancestors. Their eyes once held coral and obsidian inlays believed to awaken the statue's mana. When the eyes were placed, the Moai saw watching over the living, protecting their descendants. In the Andes, two stones were animated with life. The Inca spoke of wakas, sacred places or objects inhabited by divine presence, across ocean and mountain alike. Humanity saw in stone the same eternal pulse. Could such spiritual philosophy have been born independently? Perhaps, somewhere in the deep past, these beliefs touched hands across the waves. The Pacific itself was the great unifier. Far from being an empty void, it was a living highway of currents and constellations. The stars guided canoes across its blue expanse, and oral traditions served as maps of memory. A navigator from Samoa could recite the sequence of swells and winds that led to Raraku. A priest from Raiatea could name every island touched by the same ancestral canoe. In this network, distance was not separation, it was continuity. When we look at the Pacific's megalithic sites as fragments of one greater design, a pattern begins to surface. The alignment of temples to solstices, the orientation of statues toward ancestral lands, the shared ritual emphasis on the Col point to a worldview that transcended geography. The Pacific peoples did not worship the sea as a god, but as a genealogy, an ever-living connection to their origins. Even in myth, these links persist. Legends across Polynesia speak of Hawaii, the homeland across the horizon, from which the first ancestors sailed. To the Maori, Hawaii lies beyond death, the place to which spirits return. To the Hawaiians, it is the divine birthplace. Could this mythic homeland, remembered in song across 1,000 islands, be an echo of a real, unifying civilization, one whose reach spanned from Micronesia to South America? Archaeology is cautious. The evidence remains tantalizing but incomplete. The sea has swallowed much, and the ocean floor still hides countless stories. Coral platforms erode, oral traditions shift with time. Yet the persistence of these parallels, architectural, cultural, and genetic, suggests that the Pacific was not a world of isolated tribes, but a vast constellation of cultures exchanging gods, crops, and stars. Down in recent years, underwater surveys have begun revealing submerged stone structures off the coasts of Tonga and Micronesia, raising new questions about lost harbors or ceremonial platforms drowned by rising seas. Each discovery blurs the line between archaeology and legend. Were these remnants of interland trade networks, or traces of something far older, a forgotten epoch when the Pacific itself was the stage for one of humanity's first oceanic civilizations? Standing before the Moai of Rapa Nui, one feels this network not as theory but as presence. The wind carries a resonance that seems to reach beyond the island's horizon. The statues gaze inland toward the heart of their people, yet their silence points outward to the ocean that once united them all. In the end, perhaps the Pacific's greatest monument is not a single stone, but the invisible thread that connects them, the memory of movement, of journeys taken by stars and spirit alike. The Moai, the Maori, the Langiol are fragments of a single idea, that the ocean is not a barrier, but a bridge. And though the tides have erased much, the stones still stand, facing the same sun, under the same constellations that once guided the first voyagers. Their silence is not absence, it is continuity. Across the Pacific, the stones still speak if only we learn to listen to the sea between them. Chapter 11. The Giants of Stone. Techniques of movement on the remote island of Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island. The silent gaze of the Moai has endured centuries of wind, salt, and wonder. They stand scattered across volcanic plains and coastal cliffs, each one a guardian of an age before memory. Their immense stone faces, turned toward the rising sun or the heart of the island itself, but how they came to stand. There remains one of archaeology's most haunting enigmas. Each statue weighs anywhere from 10 to 80 tons. Some reach heights of over 10 meters. They were carved from solid tuff at the volcanic quarry of Raraku, often miles away from the platforms of where they were finally raised. No metal tools, no beasts of burden, no wheels, just human hands, ropes of fiber, and will. Yet somehow, hundreds of these giants were moved across one of the most isolated landscapes on Earth. When the first European explorers arrived in 1722, they asked the islanders how their ancestors had moved such impossible weights. The answer, repeated with unwavering conviction, was simple: they walked. For centuries, this answer was dismissed as myth, an echo of lost religion mistaken for history. To the Western mind, stone does not walk. It must be dragged, rolled, or carried. But on Rapa Nui, the line between engineering and spirit is thinner than the edge of a stone chiseled on the 20th century. Theories began to multiply. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian adventurer who famously crossed the Pacific on a reed raft, visited Easter Island in the 1950s. To him, the movement of the Moai was a triumph of human ingenuity, not divine magic. He proposed that the statues were transported on wooden sledges pulled by ropes, sliding over lubricated tracks. His team even tested the idea with small replicas, proving that the method was possible at least in theory. Yet the island told a different story. Archaeologists noted that the statues' bases were curved, not flat. Their centers of gravity were slightly forward, as if designed to pivot, not slide. Many abandoned Moai along the ancient roads leaned subtly upright, frozen mid. It was as though they had been walking, just as the oral traditions claimed, in the 1980s. Czech engineer Pavel attempted to test that possibility. Using a small team and ropes tied around a replica statue, he tried to rock it side to side, coaxing it forward as one might move a refrigerator across a floor. It worked barely, but the statue space-chipped, the motion was unstable, and the technique required immense coordination. Still, the idea lingered. Could walking have been more than metaphor? 3 decades later, archaeologists Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt revisited the problem. In 2011, they built a full-scale replica weighing 5 tons, shaped precisely like those still standing along the island's roads. With 3 teams pulling in rhythmic coordination, 2 at the front, 1 at the back, the statue began to sway, rocking left, then right. It edged forward across the earth, upright, balanced, and eerily lifelike. For those who watched, it was unsettling. The Moai truly seemed to walk. Lipo and Hunt proposed that the ancient Rapa Nui engineers had intentionally designed the statues to move this way. The forward-leaning torsos, the rounded bellies, the angled bases, every detail made sense when viewed through the lens of dynamic movement. The road system itself, with its gentle slopes and curved paths, may have been built to guide this ritual procession. The walking theory did not answer everything. It explained how smaller statues might have been moved, but not the giants, the 80-ton colossi raised on coastal Ahu facing the sea. Nor did it solve the question of how such massive figures were lifted upright, or how their red stone topknots, known as puk, were placed on their heads, some weighing 10 tons each, to raise the Moai. The Rapa Nui likely employed a combination of leverage, ramps, and ritual precision. Traces of stone ramps have been found near some platforms, suggesting a gradual elevation technique. As the base of the statue was tilted into place, stones were packed underneath to support the rising weight, inch by inch, until it stood vertical. Then ropes, anchored to posts or trees that no longer exist, could have been used to control its balance. But these are hypotheses built upon fragments. The truth, like the Moai themselves, resists simplicity. Oral histories speak of mana, spiritual energy that infused both people and stone. Chiefs and priests were believed to channel it through song and ceremony, guiding the statues as living embodiments of ancestral power. To walk a Moai was not merely an act of physics. It was a sacred collaboration between the living and the dead. In this worldview, the act of moving stone was inseparable from the act of invoking spirit. Each pull of the rope, each rhythmic chant, was a call to the ancestors whose essence inhabited the statue. The islanders did not move the Moai, they invited them to move. Such beliefs might sound distant to modern ears, yet they reveal something profound about human creativity. What Western minds describe as engineering ancient societies often experienced as devotion. The rhythm of coordinated movement, the chanting, the pulsing of hundreds of feet in unison may have produced the same synchronization of effort that modern experiments replicate with science. Faith and function were one. Even today, traces of those processional roads remain visible from the air. They wind across the island like veins of memory, leading from the quarry of Raraku to every coastline. Along these paths, dozens of fallen moai still lie face down or half buried, as if frozen mid-step, interrupted in their sacred journey. Some archaeologists believe they were left behind when resources dwindled, or when rival clans clashed. Others suspect that they fell during transport, victims of imbalance on steep slopes. Yet there is another interpretation, one whispered by Rapa Nui elders, that the moai were alive only in motion, and when they fell, their mana was spent. To raise them again would have been to disturb their rest. Such stories remind us that not all knowledge is mechanical. The ancient engineers of Rapa Nui may have possessed a practical understanding of balance, the center of gravity, and material stress, but they framed it through mythic language, through a culture that saw no divide between spirit and science. The moai did not symbolize the ancestors. They were the ancestors, walking once more upon the land. Modern analysis adds new layers to this mystery. Studies of the island's volcanic tuff show that it is soft enough to carve yet strong enough to endure centuries of erosion, a choice of material both functional and symbolic. The quarry at Raraku still bears half-carved figures embedded in the slope, as if awaiting animation. Some scholars believe these unfinished moai were left deliberately, their eternal stillness preserving the sacred site as a womb of creation. When we step back, the logistics of movement begin to fade, revealing a larger truth. The Moai's journey across Rapa Nui was not just an engineering challenge, it was a ritual performance that reaffirmed the community's connection to its past. The very act of movement transformed inert stone into living ancestor. To the Rapa Nui, there was no miracle in making stone walk. It was simply the natural order of a world where everything human, earth and spirit was alive. As the centuries passed, that harmony fractured. Deforestation, conflict, and colonization silenced the songs that once made the moai move. Many statues fell, their faces turned toward the soil. Their roads grew over with grass and thyme. Yet when the wind passes through the quarry at Raraku, it carries a strange resonance, a low hum that seems to echo through the hollow eyes of the moai. Some say it is only the wind. Others hear something older, the echo of thousands of voices chanting in rhythm, ropes tightening, feet pressing against the earth, the sound of giants walking. And though their journey ended long ago, their silence still moves us, because somewhere between physics and faith, between rope and mana, lies the secret that kept these stones alive, a secret not entirely lost, only waiting perhaps for someone to listen. Chapter 12. The Eyes of the Ancestors. Choral inlays and awakening ceremonies on a windswept island in the middle of the Pacific. The moai stand in silence, massive, impassive, staring endlessly toward the horizon. For centuries their gaze has captured human imagination, yet few realize that these giant figures were never meant to be blind. In their original form, the Moai's sockets once gleamed with white coral eyes, their pupils cut from red volcanic stone. When those eyes were set into place, the people of Rapa Nui said the statues awoke. It was in that moment, when the coral was pressed into the empty sockets, when the chant rose and the air trembled, that cold stone became a tua, the living presence of an ancestor. The moai were not merely monuments, they were vessels of spirit. Through them, the dead could see again, watch again, protect again. The islanders called this awakening the opening of the eyes. It marked the instant when a statue ceased to be a carving and became, in their belief, a guardian. Archaeological discovery confirmed what oral tradition had long whispered. In the 1970s, fragments of white coral were found near several toppled moai on the island's southeastern coast. One, unearthed at Ahu no, contained a red scoria disc still intact, its pigment vivid even after centuries of burial. That coral had been delicately shaped to fit into the statue's eye sockets, the pupil inserted at the center like a burning ember. When reassembled, the effect was startling. Against the dark basalt of the moai's face, the eyes shone with life. Researchers concluded that when the moai stood upright on their Ahu ceremonial platforms, facing inland, the installation of these coral eyes signified a completed act of consecration. Until that moment, the statue was a body waiting for a soul. The eyes gave it that soul. Every awakening was a ritual. It began with offerings, baskets of yams, fish, and sweet potatoes, gifts to the ancestral spirits who would inhabit the stone. Priests in barkcloth garments chanted the genealogies of the dead, names that reached back through generations, binding the living to their lineage. The Moai's name would be spoken, its spirit invoked, its power called forth from the other world. Then came the crucial act. The eyes, carved from coral collected along the reef, would be lifted by hand and pressed into the sockets. Those who witnessed it said that they had changed. The wind slowed, the birds fell quiet. The ancestor was awake. Rapa Nui belief held that these awakened statues watched over the clan lands behind them, ensuring fertility, prosperity, and protection. their gaze, fixed inland rather than toward the sea, symbolized vigilance over the living rather than longing for the world beyond. Through them flowed the sacred energy that animated chiefs, warriors, and spirits alike. A Moai with open eyes was not only seen, it saw. Its gaze carried power. It is easy to imagine, under the sun's low light, the coral catching fire in the evening glow. Hundreds of Moai once stood along the island's perimeter, their eyes glinting white against the black stone, their shadows stretching across the earth. To those who lived there, these were not relics but presences, one a link in the chain between earth and sky, between memory and time. But, like all sacred things, the Moai's awakening was only one half of their story. The other half begins with their silence. When the first European sailors reached Rapa Nui in 1722, they recorded a strange sight. The statues were still standing, but their eyes were gone. Within a century, most had been toppled. Many were found lying face down, their sockets empty, their coral eyes shattered and scattered across the ground. To archaeologists, the reason remains uncertain. To the islanders, memory recalls an age of turmoil. According to oral tradition, the Moai fell during a time of conflict known as the Hori Moai, the statue toppling period. As rival clans fought for dwindling resources, the faith that once united them fractured. The old rituals lost meaning. The priests' chants no longer brought rain or plenty. Some say the statues were pulled down in anger, an act of rebellion against ancestors who had failed to protect their descendants. Others believe it was deliberate closure, a sacred ending. In Rapa Nui cosmology, a spirit's power could be released by returning the body to the earth. To close the eyes of the ancestors was to let them rest. The removal of the coral eyes, too, may have been part of this ritual silencing. For as long as the eyes remained, the Moai's mana endured, active, alert, dangerous. To break the coral was to sever that current, to make the guardian sleep once more. In this light, the fallen Moai were not desecrated, but decommissioned. A civilization weary of its gods may have chosen to close their gaze. Still, traces of reverence lingered even after the fall. Excavations at Raraku, the quarry where most Moai were carved, row incomplete statues left in mid-creation, as though the craftsmen had suddenly stopped, their work interrupted by some unspoken understanding. Nearby, fragments of coral lie buried in the dust, awaiting eyes that were never set. The awakening ceremony had ended forever, yet the symbolism of the eyes persisted, rippling through Polynesian culture. Across the Pacific, the eye remains a sacred motif signifying sight, spirit, and power. In Hawaii, idols were said to see once their eyes were inserted. In Tahiti, carved wooden gods received shell inlays to open their vision. Rapa Nui's tradition, though unique in form, belonged to this broader cosmology of awakening, the belief that vision itself is divine, that to see is to exist. For modern archaeologists, reconstructing this spiritual act has been an extraordinary challenge. The coral eyes, fragile and easily lost, survive in only a few examples, but their significance cannot be overstated. They transform our understanding of the Moai from inert megaliths to animate beings, objects that lived and died with their people. When replicas of the eyes were reinserted into one restored Moai at Ahu in 1979, islanders who watched the ceremony described a palpable unease. "It is alive again," one observer whispered. And indeed, for those who stood before it, the change was startling. The statue's expression, once solemn and remote, seemed to shift. It looked back. Perhaps that is what the ancient Rapa Nui felt when they opened the eyes for the first time. Not reverence alone, but recognition. The stone saw them, it remembered them, and through it, the ancestors watched once more. Today, the Moai that stand restored along the island's coast remain eyeless, their sockets empty but expectant. To see them is to feel both presence and absence, the ghost of sight, the echo of ritual. Wind moves through the hairline cracks. Waves crash in the distance. The air hums with unseen memory. It is said that the Moai do not need their eyes anymore, that they have already seen all there is to see. But sometimes, under moonlight, the illusion returns. The sockets seem to gleam faintly, as if the ancestors still look out across the island, unseen but awake. The awakening and silencing of the Moai are more than archaeological events. They are the rhythm of a civilization's soul, the breath of a people who spoke to their dead, and then fell silent when the conversation was done. Between the coral and the stone lies the story of how humans give life to matter, and how they take it away again. And perhaps, in that delicate balance between reverence and rebellion, between awakening and closure, we glimpse something universal, the eternal desire to make the unseen visible, and the quiet acceptance that, one day, even the gods must close their eyes. The wind moves through Rapa Nui's empty sockets, whispering the same question the ancestors once asked of stone. When does a spirit awaken, and when does it finally sleep? Chapter 13, The Lost Workshop. Tools and techniques. At the base of Raraku, the ancient volcanic crater of Easter Island, silence lingers like ash in the air. The wind brushes across the slopes, over hundreds of half-carved faces emerging from the earth, Moai frozen in various stages of becoming. To the untrained eye, they seem to wait for completion. But to archaeologists, The ground itself tells a deeper story. Scattered across these slopes lie thousands of shards, flakes of obsidian, basalt picks worn smooth from use, and hammerstones fractured from endless impact. This is not merely a quarry. It is a workshop, a place of creation, devotion, and exhaustion. For centuries, this hill was alive with sound. The ring of stone upon stone echoed across the island, a metronome of collective purpose. Each clang marked a fragment of time, a human heartbeat etched into rock. The artisans who worked here transformed volcanic tuff into the colossal faces that now haunt the island's coastlines. But how did they do it, and why did they stop? Modern analysis of the tools scattered across Raraku has begun to answer the first question. Obsidian flakes, some no larger than a fingernail, bear signs of precision rarely seen in prehistoric industries. These were not random chips struck in haste. Under magnification, each flake reveals microchipping, a deliberate, controlled removal of material, often to refine the delicate contours of a nose or the subtle curve of a lip. It was a technology of finesse, not brute strength. The main tools were basalt picks, dense, hard, and resilient. Sourced from quarries elsewhere on the island, they were carried here in bundles, each one lasting perhaps a day before shattering under repeated blows. Hammerstones of varying sizes allowed carvers to shift from broad, rough shaping to minute detailing. Some show evidence of repair, indicating that even the tools themselves were treated with care, almost reverence. In a 2019 study, Microscopic, where patterns on these tools revealed something astonishing. The artisans varied their strike angles to control flake size, much like early metalworkers who learned to temper and shape their tools by feel. This level of control implies generations of experimentation, a lineage of skill passed from master to apprentice. The Moai were not carved by slaves or coerced laborers, as once imagined, but by artisans, people who understood the living quality of stone. Archaeologists have identified at least 5 distinct zones within Raraku, each with its own tool types, techniques, and unfinished statues. The differences are subtle yet consistent. Variations in chisel marks, the width of the eye sockets, or the curvature of the jawline. This has led researchers to suggest that the workshops may have been clan-based, each lineage of sculptors inheriting its own style, its own interpretation of divine form. Some Moai bear traits so specific they can be traced back to individual family groups still remembered in local oral histories. This link between art and ancestry transforms the quarry from an industrial site into something sacred, a place where lineage, labor, and belief converged. To carve a Moai was to bring memory into matter. Each figure embodied an ancestor, a guardian, or a living presence meant to hold them honor the spiritual force of the community. The act of carving was itself ritual. Tools were sharpened in silence, the first blow accompanied by chant or offering. Every stroke was a dialogue between human will and volcanic stone. Yet Raraku also bears the scars of struggle. Across its slopes lie unfinished colossi, some only partially freed from the bedrock, others fully shaped but never raised. One of these, the largest Moai ever attempted, stretches more than 20 meters long and weighs over 200 tons. It lies face up, eternally incomplete. Archaeologists believe the carvers began to hollow beneath it, preparing to separate it from the ground, before abandoning the effort. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps the stone fractured, perhaps resources dwindled, or perhaps the island society itself began to fracture under the weight of its own ambition. The evidence of exhaustion is everywhere. Tools left incomplete carvings at various stages of detail, discarded flakes forming mounds meters deep. It is as though the artisans vanished overnight, leaving their workshop as a ghost of collective effort, a civilization's heartbeat that simply stopped. Still, to imagine these carvers at work is to glimpse a society at its zenith of coordination. Raraku was not a site of chaos, but of meticulous organization. Each statue began as a rough outline, sketched into the cliff face. Teams worked, side by side, sometimes on dozens of figures simultaneously. As one group struck the stone, another prepared ropes and sleds for transport. Communication must have been constant, rhythmic chants keeping time, guiding motion. The Moai were carved lying flat, face up, their backs fused to the mountain. Once complete, the figures were cut free, slid downhill along prepared tracks, and transported somehow across miles of rugged terrain to their final resting places along the coast. The tools found near these transport paths are identical to those from the quarry, suggesting that the same artisans oversaw both carving and movement, a continuity of craftsmanship from birth to placement. Yet for all the precision of the tools and planning, the methods of transport remain uncertain. Some researchers argue the statues were rolled on log sledges. Others propose they were walked upright, using ropes and coordinated rocking, a theory supported by experiments in the 2010s. But beneath these technical debates lies something deeper: the unbroken connection between the tools, the carvers, and the spiritual purpose of the Moai themselves. In the island's oral traditions, the carvers were not mere laborers, they were Tangata Moai, the people of the statues. Their skills were seen as divine inheritance. To carve was to commune with ancestors. To shape stone was to give body to memory. Every chip, every groove, every polished surface carried meaning. The basalt hammers, the obsidian flakes, even the discarded fragments were infused with spiritual charge. Some tools were buried deliberately, perhaps as offerings to the mountain that gave them form. Others were left beside unfinished statues, like tools placed at a tomb. Modern archaeologists find in these fragments the fingerprints of both mastery and fatigue. The level of control microchipping so fine it rivals early metal carving reveals a people who had reached the apex of their craft. But the volume of debris, the sheer number of abandoned tools suggests that production had become relentless, perhaps unsustainable. Was statue-making still an act of devotion, or had it become an economy of prestige? The question haunts every flake and fracture. Some scholars propose that the island's clans competed to build ever larger moai, each seeking to outshine the others in a cycle of status and rivalry. The quarry, then, was both a sanctuary and a battlefield of pride. If that is true, the unfinished giants scattered across Raraku are more than artistic relics. They are the physical limits of belief, the point where reverence turned into burden. When the last artisans laid down their tools, they left behind more than half-carved statues. They left a coded language of technique, the slope of a chisel mark, the grain of a fracture, the angle of a strike. In these details lies an entire philosophy of making, and knowledge as precise as any written script. Centuries later, when explorers first reached Easter Island and saw the moai standing sentinel along its coasts, they could not imagine the world that created them. They saw only the finished forms, not the toil beneath. But every moai standing or fallen carries within it the rhythm of the workshop, the echo of basalt against tuff, the patience of hands that carved faces to outlast time itself. Today, the slopes of Rongorongo are quiet once more. The tools are gone, their edges dulled by centuries of wind. Yet when the light shifts across the quarry at dusk, shadows fill the carved hollows, and it seems the artisans have only just stepped away. Their work remains unfinished, but perhaps that is the point. The mountain itself is the last sculpture and eternal workshop, carved by human will and abandoned to the elements. That the moai still stare outward, their silence heavy with the weight of creation. The tools that shaped them have turned to dust, but their purpose endures, to remind us that every civilization leaves its memory in the act of making, and that sometimes what is left unfinished speaks most clearly of all. Chapter 14: Petroglyphs and Hidden Symbols. Long before the world knew of Rapa Nui for its monumental statues, the island's story had already been carved into stone. Across its black lava plains, along cliffs that faced the restless Pacific, and deep within ancient caves, thousands of petroglyphs marked the land like a second skin, an open-air script of mystery and devotion. Turtles, birds, fish, spirals, canoes, human figures with outstretched arms or bird-like faces. Each symbol etched with patience, each line cut by hand into volcanic rock that has witnessed both creation and collapse. Together they form one of the densest concentrations of rock art anywhere on Earth. More than 4,000 glyphs spread across hundreds of sites, silently chronicling the thoughts, rituals, and fears of the island's ancestors. To the untrained eye, these carvings appear as decoration. But to those who have walked Rapa Nui's windswept cliffs at dawn, they are something more, a landscape encoded with meaning, a form of communication older than any spoken memory. The petroglyphs tell us that Rapa Nui was not merely a land of colossal heads, but a living text. A text written not in words but in shapes, repetition, and orientation. Many of the carvings are found near ceremonial centers such as Oahu, Vainapu, and Papavaka. These were not random locations. Rongorongo, perched high above the sea, served as the ritual heart of the Birdman Cult, a ceremony that united politics, religion, and astronomy. Here, on the smooth basalt surfaces, hundreds of petroglyphs depict the Manu Tereth, the sacred Suti, turn alongside human figures with avian heads, known as Tangata Manu or Birdman. Each spring, when the birds returned from the ocean to nest on the islets of Motunui, the people of Rapa Nui gathered at Rongorongo to witness a contest unlike any other. Competitors would scale the cliffs, swim through shark-infested waters, and retrieve the first egg laid by the Manu Tereth. The victor's clan would rule the island for the coming year. These events were immortalized in stone. The carvings at Rongorongo do not merely depict birds, they encode the ritual calendar itself, the rhythm of migration and renewal. Some glyphs align with the rising of the Pleiades, marking the turning of seasons, the time when the birds would return. The petroglyphs, in this sense, are both art and almanac, a calendar carved into the bones of the island. Elsewhere, other motifs appear: turtles, symbols of longevity and fertility; fishhooks, representing the abundance of the sea; spirals and concentric circles, whose meaning remains elusive, yet which appear again and again like the pulse of an unseen idea. At Papavoka, a vast field of petroglyphs near the island's northern coast, the carvings stretch across the lava as if poured from memory. There are canoes with human figures aboard, suggesting voyages, perhaps the memory of ancestral migration from Polynesia, or mythic journeys between worlds. Here to appear strange, undulating shapes, fish and sea creatures, guardians of the oceanic realm. But beyond their symbolic diversity, scholars have noticed something else: a hidden order. Certain motifs reappear in precise arrangements, often in relation to the cardinal directions or celestial events. At Rongorongo, for instance, many Birdman glyphs face toward the western horizon, the direction of the setting sun and of death. Near Ahu Construction, the largest Moai platform, spirals and geometric patterns align with the midsummer sunrise. This has led some researchers to propose that the petroglyphs were not merely sacred art, but astronomical markers, mapping the movements of the sun, stars, and moon across the year. The island itself may have been conceived as a cosmic mappage, carving a point in a celestial geometry, known only to its creators. The deeper one looks, the more one senses that these carvings were never meant to be isolated symbols. They formed a system of visual language that blended myth, lineage, and astronomy into a single sacred code. And here, a tantalizing link emerges: the undeciphered Rongorongo script, discovered in the 19th century. The wooden tablets inscribed with Rongorongo glyphs remain one of the world's great linguistic mysteries. Despite decades of study, no one has conclusively deciphered their meaning. Yet many of the signs on those tablets echo shapes found in the island's petroglyphs: birdmen, fish, boats, crescents, and spirals. Was Rongorongo an evolution of the petroglyph tradition, a formal written language that emerged from centuries of carving sacred symbols into stone? Or were both systems parallel expressions of the same cosmological worldview, one etched into wood and another into rock? If so, then the petroglyphs of Rapa Nui are not just prehistoric art, they are the oldest chapters of an untranslatable book, one that continued onto the tablets long after the stones were set. Unfortunately, when European contact came in the 18th and 19th centuries, the island's social order collapsed under disease, enslavement, and conversion. The keepers of sacred knowledge, priests, carvers, navigators, were silenced. By the time Western scholars began collecting the Rongorongo tablets, the language had already died. And so, the code of Rapa Nui remains sealed, scattered across rock and wood, awaiting the patient eye that will one day read it again. Still, fragments of meaning survive. Among the islanders' oral traditions are tales that may illuminate the carvings. The turtle, for instance, was said to represent the womb of the world, the great mother who bore humanity. The birdman symbolized the union of heaven and earth, of spirit and flesh. Spirals marked portals, thresholds between the seen and the unseen. Viewed this way, the carvings transform into a kind of spiritual cartography, maps, not of geography, but of belief. Their placement across cliffs, caves, and coastal rock faces may trace an invisible network of sacred power points, connecting the island's rituals to the sky above and the sea beyond. Caves in particular played a vital role. Many contained petroglyphs deep within their walls, illuminated only by flickering torchlight. These were not public displays, they were acts of initiation, hidden communications with the divine. Some archaeologists believe the cave carvings correspond to astral maps or genealogical records, meant to guide the soul after death. Even the act of carving itself was sacred. The carver, or Tuhutna, was not merely an artist but a mediator, a vessel through whom ancestral power was channeled into the rock. Each incision was a prayer, each figure a living spirit. The islanders called this force monospiritual energy that resides in people, objects, and places. To carve a figure into stone was to anchor mana into matter, to make the invisible visible. The petroglyphs, then, are repositories of power, spiritual batteries still humming softly beneath centuries of rain and salt. And so, the mystery of Rapa Nui expands beyond its statues. The Moai may be the island's face, but the petroglyphs are its voice, a whisper from a civilization that spoke in symbols instead of words. Today, as archaeologists digitally scan and catalog each carving, new patterns continue to emerge. Software reveals alignments invisible to the naked eye, clusters that correspond to the solstices, or to the rising points of certain stars once used in Polynesian navigation. Slowly a vision forms, Rapa Nui, not as an isolated speck of land, but as part of a vast Pacific network of knowledge, connecting astronomy, myth, and art across oceans. Yet for all the data and analysis, the essence of these carvings remains elusive. Their power lies precisely in what they withhold. The wind still moves across the stones, the sun still traces the same path the ancients watched, and the carvings still look toward the sea, their meanings locked in place like constellations frozen in rock. Were they lessons for future generations, maps for the soul's journey, or messages meant for gods alone? No one can say for sure. But as the island continues to erode beneath wind and wave, the petroglyphs endure, each line a fragment of thought from a world that refused to vanish without a trace. Perhaps, in the end, that is their true message. That meaning is not always meant to be read, but felt as the carvers once felt it, as the earth still feels it. The island keeps its secrets, the symbols wait. And the stones remember. Chapter 15: Caves of Refuge and Memory. Beneath the jagged outcrops of ancient volcanic rock, the desert breathes and whispers. Wind sighs through fissures and tunnels carved by both nature and time, carrying the dust of forgotten centuries. Here, under the heavy silence of stone, lie the caves of refuge and memory, the hidden sanctuaries of a people who once called the Sahara home, when the world around them was slipping away. For thousands of years, The Sahara was alive, green, generous, and filled with rivers and life. But as the climate turned, and the grasslands faded to sand, something within human civilization also began to retreat. Villages vanished, cattle paths turned to dunes, and the survivors of this transformation sought protection where the earth still offered it. In the caves, these caverns became more than shelters. They became vaults of memory, places where life, art, and spirit could survive even as the world outside collapsed. Archaeologists exploring the Tadrot Akakis and Tassili Naja ranges in Libya and Algeria have mapped hundreds of such caves. Some are small and shallow, fit for a single family. Others plunge deep into the rock, twisting into labyrinths where darkness and silence seem eternal. Within them they found not only the remains of dwellings, but burials, painted walls, and objects of devotion, beads, potsherds, carved stones, and fragments of bone dot. These are not the random remains of wanderers. They are the deliberate traces of communities that sought to preserve what little they had: food, tools, memory, and meaning within the womb of the earth itself. In several chambers, soot stains mark the ceilings where ancient fires once burned. The air must have been heavy with smoke, the glow of flames reflecting off the damp stone, illuminating faces drawn close in quiet ritual. Here, under the mountain's shelter, people spoke their myths, mourned their dead, and marked their presence on the walls, not as conquerors, but as witnesses of loss. The paintings inside these caves are haunting in their simplicity. Stylized birds stretch their wings across rock panels. Geometric spirals intersect like coded prayers, and faces human yet abstract peer through time with an eerie calm. Unlike the vibrant pastoral scenes of earlier Saharan art, the hunters, the cattle, the dancers, these later paintings feel restrained, almost more. The brushstrokes are thinner, the colors darker, the compositions more symbolic than celebratory. It is as if the artists no longer painted life around them, but the memory of life. Perhaps these caves marked a cultural turning point, a moment when survival eclipsed prosperity, when communities withdrew inward, both physically and spiritually. The art suggests that these people were no longer depicting abundance, but recording endurance. The birds, perhaps, symbolized souls in flight. The spirals, cycles of loss and renewal. The faces, echoes of ancestors watching over those who remained. Among the most intriguing discoveries are burials placed within the cave floors or along the walls, sealed by stones or layers of sediment. Many of these individuals were buried in crouched positions, their bodies dusted with ochre, their possessions carefully arranged beside them. In some sites, infants were interred near adults, perhaps family members, suggesting that, even amid crisis, kinship remained sacred. These burials tell of a culture that viewed death not as abandonment, but as continuity. The cave was not merely a tomb, it was a passage, a bridge between the living and the dead. Anthropologists believe that in times of famine or violence, entire clans may have retreated into these caves, living for months or even years within the stone. When the surface world became too hostile, they turned inward, creating societies within darkness, societies that remembered what light once was. In one cave, faint red symbols mark a narrow alcove, possibly a ritual chamber. In another, the skeleton of a woman was found wrapped in animal hide, beside fragments of pottery still bearing soot from cooking fires. Elsewhere, the remains of children lay near the entrance, as if placed there to guard or to be guarded. Each cave tells a fragment of the same story of people caught between survival and remembrance, between loss and persistence. Some of these sanctuaries were later reused by different groups over centuries. Layers of occupation blend together, creating a kind of geological record of human memory. Each generation carved its own marks atop the last, unaware that it was writing a palimpsest of civilization, one that would only be read again thousands of years later. What makes these sites extraordinary is not merely their archaeology, but their psychology. To seek refuge underground is to make a statement that what matters most is not visibility, but preservation. The caves were wombs of resistance, places where identity was kept alive when the world above turned alien. The people who hid here carried with them a fragile inheritance, the stories of ancestors, the songs of cattle herders, the myths of a wetter, greener age. In darkness, they whispered these stories to their children, ensuring that even if the land was lost, the memory of belonging was not. And in this way, the caves became archives of the soul, stone libraries where emotion, art, and grief were recorded in pigment and silence. Some researchers have compared the Saharan cave refuges to the later monastic traditions of North Africa, isolated sanctuaries where humans withdrew from chaos to commune with the eternal. The parallel is poetic, if not literal. In both cases, retreat becomes revelation. When the outside world collapses, humanity often seeks truth within walls, whether carved by hand or by lava. The caves of the ancient Sahara may have been the first such sanctuaries, spaces where crisis forced reflection, and reflection became culture. In this sense, they were both shelters and mirrors. Within them, the last remnants of a fading world contemplated what it meant to remain human amid desolation. Archaeologists studying the pigment layers of the paintings have found evidence of continuity. The same mineral bases, the same ochre and charcoal mixtures, used across centuries. This consistency suggests not only technological stability, but cultural fidelity. Even as populations declined, even as the desert advanced, the survivors continued to reproduce the same symbols, the same visual grammar. It is as if painting itself became an act of remembrance, a ritual renewal of identity against the silence of extinction. When the last rains fell and the last herds moved south, these cave painters were perhaps the final witnesses of a lost ecology. They painted what memory retained: birds that no longer flew overhead, faces that no longer smiled in the light, and geometric signs, representing the invisible order they still believed governed the world. That to stand in these caves today is to feel that order still humming faintly. The walls seem alive with presence. The pigments, though faded, retain their intent. Every line feels deliberate, even desperate, the art of a people writing themselves against erasure. Some caves still bear the prints of human hands, pressed in pigment, the most primal signature of all. Each handprint says, "I was here, I existed, remember me." And perhaps that is the most enduring message of these caves, that memory itself can be architecture. As centuries turned to millennia, the world above moved on. Empires rose on the Nile, kingdoms flourished along the Niger, and traders crossed the desert with gold and salt. The people who once sheltered in these volcanic sanctuaries vanished, leaving no descendants we can name. But their voices did not disappear. They remain embedded in the stone, in pigments, bones, and the quiet geometry of their marks. Each cave, with its ochre faces and geometric symbols, is a whisper from the underworld of history, a reminder that even as civilizations crumble, memory finds refuge. The sands may bury the cities, but the caves endure, and within them, in the cool stillness beneath the desert's burning silence, something human continues to breathe, the unbroken will to remember. Chapter 16: The Arrival of Missionaries. The 19th century was an age of sails and salvation, when the edges of the world, once unreachable, became the battlegrounds of belief. In the 1860s, as whaling ships and colonial expeditions crisscrossed the Pacific, the small volcanic island, known to its people as Rapa Nui and to outsiders as Easter Island, became the stage for a different kind of conquest, not of land, but of spirit. The missionaries had arrived. Their ships appeared on the horizon like omens, cutting through the mist that hung over the Pacific like a veil. To the islanders, these newcomers came dressed in black robes, bearing crosses instead of spears. They spoke of sin and salvation, of heaven and hell, words alien to a people whose cosmology had been carved in stone and sung in ritual since time beyond memory. The island's ancient order, already fractured by slave raids, disease, and famine, now faced its final transformation. The Catholic missionaries of the Sacred Heart, led by Father Eugene Arrow, came ashore with conviction and fire. To them, the island was a place of lost souls, a desolate remnant of heathen worship in need of redemption. To the islanders, weary from suffering, these men offered structure, medicine, and a strange kind of peace. Yet beneath that peace, a slow erasure began. At first, the missionaries sought to understand the island's customs, its chants, its curious wooden carvings, but understanding quickly gave way to condemnation. The towering Moai statues, silent and watchful, were dismissed as pagan idols. The intricate Rongorongo tablets, inscribed with a writing system still unreadable today, were declared objects of superstition. Many were seized, burned, or broken, destroyed in the name of salvation. The oral traditions that once tied the islanders to their ancestors were recast as heresies to be forgotten. It was not an erasure done in rage, but in righteousness, and that made it all the more devastating. The missionaries believed they were saving souls from darkness. They could not see that they were extinguishing one of the last living links to a prehistoric world. Only a few tablets survived, smuggled, hidden, or traded as curiosities to passing sailors. Today, fewer than 30 are known to exist, scattered across museums and private collections. Their glyphs, spirals, birds, human figures, and sacred forms remain undeciphered. Linguists and anthropologists have spent over a century trying to crack their code, suspecting they contain genealogies, hymns, or cosmological maps, but their silence endures. They are the voices of a civilization gagged by conversion. Father Arrow wrote of his mission with quiet satisfaction. He spoke of baptisms, of schools, of the building of a chapel at Hangaroa. He also wrote, almost in passing, of the burning of idols, describing how the people willingly surrendered their sacred objects for the glory of God. But history has another way of reading such acts. To modernize those fires are less purification than pyres where knowledge was consumed, and yet, even in the ashes, something survived. For not all conversions were absolute. Some islanders accepted Christianity outwardly, while inwardly weaving their ancestral beliefs into the new faith. The Ariki, the hereditary chiefs, and the Tangata Rongorongo, the keepers of sacred knowledge, adapted their chants and myths to align with biblical narratives. Old gods were recast as saints, ancestral spirits became angels. The ancient cosmology of creation, The birth of the world from the union of sky and sea was quietly folded into Christian hymns. This quiet resistance, or perhaps adaptation, is what kept the island's soul alive. In village gatherings and secret songs, fragments of the old world endured. The Birdman ritual, once a central ceremony linking the divine and the human, was reimagined through Christian lenses, its symbolism muted but not forgotten. Children still learned the rhythms of the old chants, though now they were sung under the watchful eyes of priests. The faith had changed, but the melody remained to the missionaries. These syncretic expressions were signs of incomplete conversion. To the people, there was survival. The islanders had long known how to endure through drought, famine, and isolation. Now they learned to endure through disguise. The spiritual language of their ancestors retreated beneath the surface, encoded in metaphors and songs that the priests mistook for prayers. By the late 19th century, nearly the entire population of Rapa Nui had been baptized. The wooden idols were gone. The stone Ahu platforms, once the stages for sacred rituals, had been repurposed as quarry sites or farmland. The Moai, toppled in earlier civil strife, remained fallen, their faces buried in the soil, as if ashamed. Only the wind seemed to remember the chants once sung at dawn. But the missionaries too were transformed by the island. They came seeking conquest and found instead a riddle. In their journals, there is often a tone of unease, a sense that beneath the outward compliance of their converts, something older persisted. Father Hippolyte Roussel, who succeeded Aro, noted that the people continued to gather at night to sing songs of unknown meaning. He called them vestiges of idolatry. Yet perhaps they were something more coded memories of the time before the cross. Even the language began to shift. The ancient Rapa Nui tongue absorbed biblical vocabulary while retaining its mythic cadence. The missionaries translated catechisms and prayers into local speech. But in doing so, they preserved words and sounds that might otherwise have vanished. Ironically, the very tools of erasure became instruments of preservation. Still, what was lost cannot be measured. The destruction of the Rongorongo tablets remains one of the great tragedies of anthropology, not merely for their rarity, but for what they represented. A written voice of Polynesia, unique and self-born, extinguished before it could speak. No one knows how many existed before the missionaries' fires, or what stories they told. Creation myths, laws, histories, songs, perhaps all of them. Their silence now mirrors the island itself, a place once overflowing with expression, now pared down to fragments. Some scholars suggest that echoes of Rongorongo survive within oral tradition, that the rhythmic chants, known as kai may preserve linguistic structures akin to the tablet's sequences. In this way, the knowledge may not have been destroyed, only transmuted, carried not in wood, but in memory. Like embers buried in ash, waiting for air. The arrival of the missionaries was not a single moment, but a long descent, a slow covering of the island's memory beneath new language, new symbols, new fears. And yet, even as the flames of faith consumed the old world, they could not entirely burn away its essence. Beneath the Christian prayers, one can still hear the heartbeat of the ancient chants. Beneath the crucifix, the shadow of the Moai still lingers. History often frames this encounter as conquest, the triumph of the church over the primitive, but perhaps it was something more complex, more human, a merging of necessity and survival. The islanders learned to navigate the new order as they had once navigated the sea, by stars unseen but deeply known. In doing so, they ensured that some part of their story, however veiled, would endure. Today, when descendants of Rapa Nui sing their ancestral songs in church festivals, few realize how many layers of time echo within each note. The rhythm of drums that once called spirits now accompanies hymns to the Virgin. The dances once dedicated to Tangata Manu, the Birdman, now celebrate resurrection. The line between past and present blurs, not in defiance, but in continuity. The missionaries believed they had brought light to darkness, but perhaps they only changed the shape of the flame. And as the Pacific wind moves through the fallen Moai and the silent platforms of Raraku, one can still sense that the old gods are listening, not angry, not gone, only waiting. Waiting for their names to be spoken again. Chapter 17: Slavery, Disease, and Diaspora. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from any mainland, lies a speck of land once known as Te Pito o Te Hunua, the navel of the world. Today we call it Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Its cliffs rise from the waves like a memory half awake, crowned with silent sentinel stone faces watching the sea that once gave life and later brought ruin. For centuries, this island civilization thrived in isolation. Its people carved their ancestors into volcanic stone, raised them upon vast platforms, and maintained complex systems of agriculture and kinship in one of the most remote places on Earth. But in the 19th century, that world collapsed not by slow erosion or internal strife, but by contact with a world that saw the Pacific not as sacred ocean, but as resource, as labor, as profit. The year was 1862. Across South America, the plantations of Peru were desperate for workers. The abolition of African slavery had left a vacuum in the brutal economies of guano extraction and sugar cultivation. To fill it, traders turned their eyes toward the Pacific. What followed would become one of the most devastating human raids in Polynesian history. Slavers set sail from Callao in fleet small ships, armed and organized, masquerading as merchants. They came bearing gifts and promises of trade. But what they brought was deception. Over the course of months, they swept across the islands of the Central Pacific, taking by force or coercion anyone they could seize, men, women and children alike. When they reached Rapa Nui, the island's fate was sealed. By the end of that year, over 1,400 Rapa Nui people, nearly half the island's population, had been taken. Chiefs, priests, carvers, navigators, those who held the knowledge of their ancestors, were dragged onto ships bound for Lima and the Chincha Islands. There, under a blazing foreign sun, they were forced to mine guano, a substance formed from the excrement of seabirds, prized by Western nations as fertilizer. The irony was brutal. The living were made to harvest death to sustain the soil of lands they would never see again. Few survived. The conditions were inhuman: heat, confinement, disease, and starvation claimed most within months. Reports from missionaries and consuls reached the outside world, sparking public outrage. Under pressure, Peru was forced to act. In 1863, a handful of captives were ordered repatriated, but by then, it was too late. Of the few who returned to Rapa Nui, most carried with them the seeds of plague, smallpox and tuberculosis, diseases the island had never known. Within a year, the population collapsed. From thousands, only a few hundred survived. The missionaries who arrived soon after described a landscape of desolation: villages empty, families vanished, traditions broken. The great genealogies, once recited like living memory, ended in silence. The priestly class, the Ariki and Rongorongo scribes who preserved the island's sacred knowledge, were gone. The Rongorongo tablets, carved with mysterious glyphs, are among the last remnants of that lost intellectual world. Today, no one can read them. Linguists and archaeologists have long tried to unlock their code. Some see hints of calendrical systems, others of genealogies, chants, and rituals. But without the keepers of that knowledge, the living bridge between word and world was severed. The tablets became relics, stripped of their voices. What perished in those years was not just a population, but a cosmology, a way of seeing existence where the boundary between human and stone, the spirit and landscape, was porous and alive. The Moai statues, often misunderstood as idols, were in truth embodiments of ancestors, living presences anchoring the lineage of the people to the land. The dead stood among the living, facing inland to protect their descendants. When the raids came, when disease took hold, it was as if the island itself fell silent. Missionary records tell of survivors wandering among the toppled Moai, weeping and speaking to them as if to the dead, pleading for guidance, for forgiveness, for memory. The carvings that once stood as guardians became tombstones, oral tradition. Once the island's sacred thread, frayed beyond repair. By the late 1870s, the population had fallen to fewer than 150 people. Those who lived carried within them an unbearable legacy, the trauma of survival. Children grew up without elders to teach the old chants or explain the meaning of the Ahu, the stone platforms that lined the coasts. The ancient rites tied to navigation, astronomy, and fertility, the heartbeat of Polynesian culture, were replaced by fragments, whispers, and missionary hymns. The diaspora that began with slavery did not end with liberation. It continued in the exile of memory itself. Some Rapa Nui were later transported to Tahiti or Mangareva, scattered among missionary networks. A few remained in Peru, intermarrying into other Pacific communities, their descendants unaware of their origins. The genetic lines dispersed, like seeds carried by storm. But on Rapa Nui itself, those who remained fought to hold on to keep even a shadow of what had been. By the end of the 19th century, the island had become a colonial outpost, leased by Chilean interests for sheep ranching. The surviving Rapa Nui were confined to one small settlement at Hangaroa, forbidden to roam their ancestral lands. The rest of the island, its sacred fields, its statues, its graves, became pasture. A world that had once been animated by reverence was reduced to property. It is easy from a distance to see this as simply another tragedy of colonization. But for Rapa Nui, the loss was metaphysical. The ancestral order of stone, the belief that mana, spiritual power, flowed through lineage, through carving, through the land itself, was interrupted. The Moai, once seen as living presences, now faced tourists and waves instead of descendants. The rituals of renewal, the songs that linked generations, fell silent. Even so, memory has a way of surviving in hidden places. Within families, fragments of chants and genealogies were whispered and passed down in secret. Some elders continued to speak of the Hatumat, the first voyager who brought their ancestors across the ocean, and of the Tangata Manu, the Birdman ritual that once renewed the bond between sky, sea, and earth. These remnants became a quiet resistance, a refusal to let the past disappear completely. In the 20th century, scholars, Polynesian navigators, and Rapa Nui descendants began the long work of reconstruction. Linguists catalogued the language, Archaeologists mapped the Ahu platforms and re-erected fallen Moai, but there are limits to what science can restore. A worldview cannot be excavated, it must be lived. The loss of those who carried sacred knowledge, the genealogists, the astronomers, the Rongorongo readers left a void no artifact can fill. And yet, perhaps something of their vision remains not in words, but in the stones themselves. When the trade winds pass over the island at dusk, the Moai seemed almost to breathe. Their weathered faces, eroded but unbroken, stand as both monument and warning. They remind us that civilizations do not die only from conquest or famine, but from the erasure of meaning when voices are silenced and memory is uprooted from the soil that nourished it. Rapa Nui's tragedy was not just the story of enslavement and disease. It was the unraveling of an entire language, of being a worldview in which stone was kin and the earth itself remembered. The slavers did not only steal bodies, they stole continuity. The missionaries did not only bring faith, they brought forgetfulness. And time, indifferent, buried what remained beneath layers of grief. Today, the descendants of those few survivors still walk among the Moai. They speak a revived language, sing restored songs, and tell stories of both loss and endurance. The island breathes again, but differently. Its silence is no longer emptiness but reverence, a mourning that has learned to live. When the sun sets over the cliffs of Rano Kau, where the statues lie half-carved in stone, one can almost feel the echo of what was lost to people whose ancestors once stood between worlds, whose living stones still whisper through the wind. And perhaps that whisper carries a message not just for Rapa Nui, but for all of us. That memory is fragile, and when a worldview dies, it takes with it a way of seeing the sacred in the world. The Moai still stand not merely as relics of the past, but as sentinels of warning. To forget them would be to let the silence win again. Chapter 18. The Rediscovery and Early Archaeology. When the first modern explorers set eyes on Easter Island, Rapa Nui, the island seemed like a paradox carved in stone, a remote speck adrift in the vast Pacific, littered with colossal statues that stared endlessly toward the horizon. Who built them? How did they move? And why had this island, once so alive with art and devotion, fallen into near silence? For centuries, the Moai of Rapa Nui had stood as mute witnesses to their own mystery. By the dawn of the 20th century, they were more legend than facts, whispered about by sailors, romanticized by poets, and dismissed by scholars as curiosities from an isolated world. It would take a handful of determined archaeologists, driven by obsession as much as intellect, to reawaken the island's story. The modern rediscovery of Rapa Nui began not with conquest, but with curiosity. In 1914, Catherine Routledge, a British archaeologist and anthropologist, set sail with her husband, William Scoresby, aboard a small yacht named Manna. What she found on that desolate island would shape the foundation of Easter Island archaeology for the next century. Routledge was one of the first to approach Rapa Nui with both scientific rigor and human empathy. She lived among the islanders for over a year, learning their language, recording oral traditions, and documenting more than 800 Moai scattered across the island. Her notebooks, filled with sketches, maps, and meticulous observations, captured not just the monuments but the spirit of a people whose history had been largely silenced by colonial intrusion. She discovered that each Moai was not merely a statue, but an embodiment of an ancestor vessel through which spiritual power, or mana, was channeled to protect and sustain the living. Her excavations around Ahu Tongariki and Ahu Kote Riku revealed that many statues were partially buried, their torsos hidden beneath centuries of windblown soil. Beneath the surface, she found carvings, ceremonial tools, and remnants of the platforms that once supported elaborate rituals. Yet Routledge's work was more than excavation. It was an act of translation between worlds. She treated the Rapa Nui people not as relics of a vanishing race but as custodians of profound memory. Her 1919 book, The Mystery of Easter Island, offered the first attempt to reconcile archaeology with living tradition. For the first time, Western readers saw Easter Island not as a riddle to be solved, but as a civilization to be understood. Still, Routledge's findings were overshadowed by another, far more controversial voice. In the 1950s, Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer famous for his Kon-Tiki expedition, arrived on Easter Island with a different vision, one rooted less in anthropology than in mythic imagination. To Heyerdahl, the island's mystery could not be explained solely by Polynesian isolation. He believed that the Moai builders might have been influenced or even founded by voyagers from South America. His theory was bold. It suggested that ancient peoples had crossed the Pacific long before European navigation, sailing from Peru or the Andes to Rapa Nui on rafts or reed boats. To many, it was a romantic echo of lost civilizations and sunken continents. To others, it was an intrusion, an attempt to rewrite Polynesian genius in foreign terms. Heyerdahl's 1955-56 expedition was both ambitious and cinematic. With a team of Chilean and Norwegian researchers, he excavated around the Moai of Rano, Raraku, and Anak. They unearthed tools of basalt and obsidian, fragments of rope, and evidence that the statues had once been painted in bright pigments, ochre, reds and whites that glowed beneath the sun. He also oversaw the re-erection of a fallen Moai, proving that ancient islanders could have raised them with simple wooden levers and coordinated manpower. But his conclusions were met with skepticism. Linguistic, genetic, and cultural evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Polynesian origins. The Rapa Nui language was Austronesian, kin to those of Tahiti and Hawaii. The island's agricultural practices, sweet potatoes, chickens, banana cultivation, matched those of the wider Polynesian world, and radiocarbon dating, refined in the decades after Heyerdahl's visit, placed the earliest settlements between 900 and 1200 CE, centuries before European contact and long after any plausible South American migration. Even so, Heyerdahl's influence was profound. He reignited global fascination with Easter Island, turning its silent statues into global icons of mystery. His theory, though discredited in academia, sparked a generation of explorers, filmmakers, and writers to look again at the Pacific not as an empty void, but as a web of ancient connections. The tension between Heyerdahl's romanticism and scientific evidence mirrored a broader struggle within archaeology itself. Was the discipline a science of measurement and data or a search for meaning? Rapa Nui stood at that crossroads, its stones absorbing both dreams and debates. As the 20th century progressed, the science grew sharper. In the 1960s and 70s, archaeologists such as William Malloy and Sergio Rapuhua deepened the island's chronology through stratigraphic analysis and radiocarbon testing. They confirmed that the Moai were not relics of a vanished race, but the achievements of a Polynesian culture that had flourished in profound isolation. That early settlers, probably arriving from the Marquesas or Mangareva, brought with them a memory of navigation that could span the entire Pacific. They transformed volcanic rock into ancestors, creating a landscape of devotion unlike anywhere else on Earth. Over time, ecological strain and deforestation led to internal conflict, symbolized by the toppling of Moai during later centuries. But even in collapse, the island's people adapted, replacing stone reverence with new rituals, new stories, and new ways of survival. Modern techniques continue to peel back the layers that early explorers could only guess at. Remote sensing, 3D scanning, and soil analysis reveal that Rapa Nui was far from barren. It once supported a complex network of gardens, irrigation systems, and quarry roads that connected every Moai site. Genetic studies show continuity between ancient and modern islanders, affirming what Routledge sensed intuitively, that the people of Rapa Nui never vanished, they endured. And yet, the allure of Heyerdahl's myth never truly died, perhaps because it speaks to something deeper than evidence, to the human longing for hidden connections. For the idea that the world's mysteries are linked by forgotten journeys. The Moai, in their quiet majesty, seem to invite that kind of dreaming. Today, archaeologists tread carefully between the precision of science and the poetry of wonder. The island has become both laboratory and shrine, where drones map ancient quarries even as descendants perform ancestral dances nearby. Each discovery confirms what has long been felt, that Rapa Nui is not a riddle to be solved, but a story still unfolding. Catherine Routledge sought to listen. Thor Heyerdahl sought to explain. Between them lies the entire history of modern archaeology's relationship with mystery, the balance between respect and revelation, between evidence and imagination. As the waves crash endlessly against the cliffs of Rano Kau, the Moai stand unmoved, stone sentinels watching as generations of outsiders arrive, measure, theorize, and leave. The island endures, patient as ever, holding its truth beneath layers of interpretation. Perhaps, in the end, the rediscovery of Rapa Nui was not about finding answers, but about remembering how to ask. Chapter 19. Astronomy and alignment. High on the windswept plains of Rapa Nui, where the horizon meets the endless expanse of Pacific sky, the Moai stand as silent witnesses to a world both terrestrial and celestial. Their eyes, carved from volcanic tuff or coral, gaze outward, unblinking across valleys, cliffs, and the distant coastline. For centuries, these colossal figures were understood primarily as embodiments of ancestral power, guardians of clans, and symbols of status. Yet, as modern archaeologists and archaeoastronomers turn their instruments skyward, a new layer of meaning begins to emerge. These statues may have also been components of a sophisticated system of cosmic observation, a bridge between stone and stars. The Rapa Nui people lived in a world where the sky was both guide and oracle. Without compasses, clocks, or modern instruments, their survival depended on careful observation of celestial patterns. The sun's movement across the horizon marked planting and harvesting seasons. The stars' risings and settings provided orientation for travel across the island and the surrounding ocean. Even subtle shifts in the moon and planets would have signaled cycles of abundance or scarcity. Against this backdrop, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Moai, towering over settlements and shorelines, might encode more than memory. They might encode knowledge itself. Recent studies using GPS mapping, LiDAR scanning, and photogrammetry have revealed patterns that were invisible to earlier generations. When researchers plotted the locations and orientations of hundreds of Moai, patterns began to coalesce. Ahu platforms on which Moai stand often align not merely with geographic features but with celestial events. Some point toward the rising sun at the solstices. Others mark equinoxes, while still more appear aimed at the heliacal rising of specific stars. Among these, Aldebaran and Canopus recur as possible targets, their risings signaling seasonal changes or navigational cues for canoes departing into the ocean. One of the most striking examples is the Ahu Tongariki complex. From certain vantage points, the 15 restored moai appear to track the winter solstice sunrise. Standing on the platform at dawn, one can imagine a Rapa Nui priest or navigator noting the sun's arrival, counting days until the next cycle. Across the island, similar alignments repeat, suggesting that the placement of each moai was deliberate, considered not only for social or spiritual purposes, but also for temporal and navigational precision. The connection between stone and sky is further supported by ethnographic accounts collected by early missionaries and explorers, though much of the island's oral tradition was lost or altered after European contact in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fragments remain. They speak of Rongorongo, ancestral figures whose eyes watched both earth and heavens. Seasonal ceremonies often occurred in tandem with celestial events, rituals timed to lunar phases, solstice sunrises, or the first appearance of migratory birds. These narratives hint at a worldview in which the physical world of Moai and Ahu was inseparable from the temporal and cosmic order. It is easy to imagine the moai as instruments of such observation. Their size and placement allowed them to function as fixed markers, reference points across the undulating terrain. Shadows cast by the rising sun may have marked dates. Lines drawn between multiple Ahu could define axes, allowing islanders to track solar movement and star risings over decades. Even centuries. LIDAR surveys have added a startling dimension to this theory. Beneath the surface and along cliff edges, previously undocumented stone alignments and pathways hint at a far more sophisticated system of mapping than was imagined. Some researchers speculate that the Ahu may have functioned like observatories, allowing for both longitudinal tracking of stars and precise calculation of the lunar calendar. Others note that certain moai oriented inland rather than toward the ocean may mark not stars but important topographical features, indicating a hybrid of cosmic and terrestrial knowledge. The correlation between moai orientation and celestial phenomena is not uniform. While some Ahu align precisely, others are angled in ways that remain unexplained. Some face inland toward extinct forests or ceremonial centers, others toward distant volcanic cones or the ocean horizon. This variability suggests that the Rapa Nui were negotiating multiple priorities: ancestral veneration, seasonal cycles, navigational markers, and perhaps even ritual symbolism, all encoded within the same stone architecture. Consider the Ahu Akivi Moai, uniquely situated to face the ocean rather than the inland settlements. These 7 statues are thought to represent explorers or navigators. Their alignment coincides with the sunset over the Pleiades, a star cluster associated in many Polynesian cultures with guidance and the passage of time. Whether the Rapa Nui understood the Pleiades in this symbolic manner is uncertain, but the repeated patterns across multiple sites imply a systemic awareness of the heavens. This blending of astronomy, navigation, and ritual mirrors practices found elsewhere in Polynesia and the wider Pacific. In Hawaii, the Heiau temples and star lines guided voyaging canoes. In Tahiti, ceremonial mounds aligned with solstices and lunar cycles. Rapa Nui, though isolated, may have preserved and transformed these traditions uniquely, encoding practical knowledge in the permanence of stone. Even the choice of moai materials may reflect cosmic considerations. The volcanic tuff from Raraku, the island's quarry, is relatively soft and workable yet durable, allowing detailed facial features while maintaining stability for long-term placement. The red scoria used for top knots may have symbolized the sun or fire, perhaps highlighting celestial connections. The interplay of shadow, sunlight, and viewing angles was likely an intentional part of the design, as evidenced by the dramatic changes in perception when statues are observed at dawn versus midday. Some scholars also speculate that moai orientation may have been tied to agricultural cycles. Rapa Nui's small arable patches would have benefited from careful observation of seasonal markers. Star risings, solstice, sunrises, and equinox positions could all inform planting and harvesting schedules, guiding not only spiritual practice but the very survival of the community. Yet, much remains uncertain. The island's oral histories, fragmented by disease, enslavement, and missionary suppression, offer tantalizing glimpses but rarely definitive explanations. Petroglyphs on Ahu and in nearby caves sometimes depict stars, birds, or geometric patterns, but their exact purpose is unknown. Did they represent constellations, mythic narratives, or coded instructions for timing ceremonies? Even the statistics of orientation provoked debate. Early studies suggested precise alignments, while more recent surveys show significant variation. Some argue this reflects intentional flexibility, a cultural priority placed on ancestral reverence over astronomical exactness. Others propose the possibility of lost knowledge, ritual rules, or observational techniques that no longer survive, leaving us only with the skeleton of a once living system. And yet, when one stands on a cliff at sunset, Gazing over the Moai toward the horizon, the effect is undeniable. The alignment feels deliberate, almost conspiratorial in its subtlety. The eyes of the statues seem to follow the sun and stars, connecting earth and sky, observer and observed. One can imagine generations of Rapa Nui people standing beneath these figures, noting the shifting light, observing the first appearance of stars, and marking the passage of time not with clocks, but with ritual and stone. In this way, the Moai may have been not only guardians of the living and the dead, but also instruments of knowledge, a slow, silent, enduring record of the cycles of sun, moon, and stars. The very stones of Rapa Nui encode a rhythm of life that transcends centuries, inviting those who study them to look upward as well as outward. The night sky above Rapa Nui remains astonishingly clear, unpolluted by modern light, a dome of infinite complexity that the islanders must have regarded with awe. Orion rises, Sirius follows, the Pleiades scatter across the heavens, and the Southern Cross tracks its eternal arc. For the Rapa Nui, as for all early observers, the heavens were a mirror, a calendar, a guide, and a canvas upon which the divine imprinted itself. The Moai, in their silent grandeur, may have been markers within this cosmic system, patient, waiting for each rising sun, each first star, each seasonal change. They encode a dialogue between human ingenuity and the eternal, a conversation written in stone and sky, the purpose of which we can glimpse but never fully recover perhaps. Their greatest secret is that the Moai stand not only as guardians of memory, but as reminders that observation and ritual were intertwined, that survival and spirituality were inseparable. The alignment of stone with sky suggests a culture that understood time as a cycle, not a line, and life as connected to forces larger than any single generation. And so, as the wind sweeps across the plains and the first stars appear over Rongorongo, the Moai continue their silent vigil. They mark not only space but time, echoing knowledge that may forever elude us. The sky above Rapa Nui holds answers we may never grasp, just as the stones below preserved questions we are only beginning to ask. The horizon stretches, eternal and unknowable, and the Moai watch it, a cosmic system carved in human hands, waiting, as if to remind us that some mysteries are not meant to be solved but simply observed. Chapter 20. The genetic puzzle beneath the volcanic slopes of Rapa Nui. The bones of the island's earliest inhabitants lie buried beneath centuries of soil, ash, and memory, silent witnesses to a world that has long passed. They now speak in a language once impossible to hear. DNA. Modern genetic analysis has begun to unravel threads of ancestry, revealing a story both familiar and extraordinary, a story of connection across vast, unthinkable distances. For decades, the origins of Rapa Nui's population were assumed to be solely Polynesian, arriving from the distant islands of the Central Pacific. Navigators in outrigger canoes, following stars and ocean swells, carried their people, plants, and culture across thousands of miles of open sea. Yet in the last decade, skeletal remains subjected to genomic sequencing have yielded hints that challenge the simplicity of this narrative. Some individuals show traces of South American ancestry, small yet statistically significant, suggesting contact with the Andean world centuries before Europeans ever set sail for the Pacific. The implications are profound. Rapa Nui sits more than 4,000 miles from the western coast of South America. To bridge this distance is not merely a feat of endurance, but a testament to the daring ingenuity of human navigation. How could people separated by oceans so vast have exchanged genes, ideas, and material culture? Archaeology offers subtle, tantalizing evidence. Sweet potatoes, a staple of Rapa Nui's early agriculture, are native to the Andes. Radiocarbon dating places their introduction to the island centuries before European colonization, a botanical footprint of transoceanic connection. The mechanisms of this exchange remain elusive. Some scholars propose that seeds drifted naturally, carried by ocean currents, birds, or storms. Others suggest intentional voyages, expeditions launched with purpose, powered by knowledge of winds, stars, and currents. Polynesian mariners were unparalleled sailors, capable of reading the swell and sky as a map, moving with a precision that would confound modern imagination. Yet the question lingers, did these voyages reach the Americas by chance, or was there a deliberate crossing of horizons long erased from memory? Genetic studies hint at episodes of contact occurring not just once, but multiple times, dispersed across generations. The admixture is subtle, suggesting intermarriage between Polynesian settlers and visitors from the continent, a human echo of botanical exchange. Sweet potatoes traveled west, carried in the soil of canoes or the hands of voyagers, while the people of Rapa Nui preserved their distinct Polynesian culture, incorporating new elements without abandoning their identity. It is a delicate balance of isolation and openness, a paradox of the Pacific world. Material evidence complements the genetic data. Archaeologists have unearthed artifacts whose origins lie beyond the islands, obsidian from the Andean highlands, stone implements resembling those of coastal Peru, and stylistic parallels in carving and pottery. Each fragment is a whisper of exchange, a trace of curiosity and connection that challenges the image of the Pacific as an ocean of solitude. The islanders were not merely drifting in isolation. They were part of a network, small and ephemeral, whose links are only now being revealed. Even more enigmatic are the cultural implications. The arrival of foreign genes and plants may have been more than a material event. It may have influenced ritual, social organization, or technology. Did contact inspire new cultivation methods, reinforce hierarchical structures, or contribute to the monumental construction of Moai? We cannot know for certain. Yet the possibility persists in the alignment of archaeology, botany, and genetics, three disciplines converging to illuminate a forgotten chapter. Recent advances in ancient DNA extraction have brought clarity, but also new questions. DNA from skeletal remains shows Polynesian markers predominating, yet with scattered South American sequences, sometimes appearing in isolated individuals. This patchwork suggests contacts may have been intermittent rather than continuous, episodic rather than sustained. Each trace is a breadcrumb of a larger story lost to the waves, erased from oral tradition, preserved only in silent molecules. The sweet potato itself tells a parallel story. Known as kumara in Rapa Nui, it appears in Polynesia and the islands of the Pacific centuries before Europeans arrived. Linguistic studies trace its name across islands, linking Rapa Nui to the broader Polynesian world, while its botanical origin anchors it to the Andes. In a single tuber, we find the imprint of both human ingenuity and natural dispersal, a convergence of ocean currents, migration, and cultural transmission. Some researchers have posited the existence of pre-Columbian maritime contacts, small-scale exchanges that occurred sporadically but left enduring legacies. Others remain cautious, noting that evidence is circumstantial and difficult to date with precision. Yet the convergence of genetics, archaeology, and botany suggests that Rapa Nui was not an isolated experiment of human settlement, but part of a wider, interconnected horizon. The implications of this are staggering. For centuries, historians and anthropologists have imagined the Pacific Islands as isolated, each culture evolving independently, bound by geography to a separate destiny. Rapa Nui challenges this assumption, revealing a world in which oceans were not barriers, but highways, conduits of life, knowledge, and exchange. In the DNA of its inhabitants, in the tubers of its fields, in the whispers of stone and bone, the Pacific pulses with a hidden network of connection. Yet mysteries remain. We cannot know the exact routes these ancient voyagers followed, nor the circumstances of their journeys. Were their return trips lost to the tides and storms? Did contact involve large groups or single expeditions? Did the Andean visitors bring knowledge of cultivation, astronomy, or ceremony? And if so, how did these influence the islanders' culture? Each discovery answers some questions while deepening the enigma. Modern technology continues to expand our understanding. Genomic sequencing, stable isotope analysis, and improved radiocarbon dating allow researchers to trace ancestry with unprecedented precision. Each skeleton, each seed, each fragment of pottery becomes a node in a complex network, a puzzle of human mobility that stretches across thousands of miles and centuries. And still, Rapa Nui's story is only partially visible. The Moai remain standing, silent witnesses to the lives of those who carved, transported, and erected them. They watch over the island, guardians of a culture that blended isolation and connection, innovation and tradition. The stones themselves hint at a society capable of monumental achievement, yet one that may have remained aware of worlds beyond its horizon. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the genetic puzzle is not the crossing of DNA alone, but the reminder that human history is rarely linear or confined. Civilizations perceived as isolated may have been participants in a vast web of exchange, sometimes fleeting, sometimes profound. The Pacific, so often imagined as empty and remote, emerges instead as a place of movement, curiosity, and possibility. Standing on the slopes of Raraku or by the crumbling quarry of unfinished Moai, one senses the echo of journeys lost to time. The islanders who first settled here may have looked across the horizon, imagining worlds they would never see, yet leaving behind traces of contact that only now reveal themselves. In every genome sequenced, in every tuber analyzed, there lies a whisper of those ancient crossings, silent, persistent, unyielding. And so the puzzle endures. Rapa Nui is at once remote and connected, insular yet cosmopolitan. Its genetic history reframes the Pacific not as a void, but as an expanse of opportunity, a theater for human ingenuity and the audacity of exploration. Each fragment of DNA, each seed carried across thousands of miles of water, hints at stories that we may never fully reconstruct, voyages erased by storms, legends forgotten, yet preserved in the quiet continuity of life itself. Perhaps, in the end, the most profound insight is the humility it inspires. The people of Rapa Nui remind us that even in isolation, humans seek connection. Across 4,000 miles of ocean, across centuries, they reached beyond themselves, leaving a trace in bone, in plant, in culture, a trace that endures, patiently waiting for science, imagination, and reverence to read its message. The genetic puzzle does not yield a final answer. It offers a lens into a world of possibility, a glimpse of a horizon once traversed by hands and sails, by curiosity and courage. And as we probe the strands of ancestry, we are invited to consider not only what was achieved, but how much remains unseen, hidden in the currents of the Pacific, and in the quiet, enduring presence of an island that once stood at the edge of the known world. Chapter 21 Theories of Lost Civilizations. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, rises from the Pacific like a solitary testament to human ambition. Its moai gaze outward, silent and immense, and for centuries they have provoked wonder and speculation alike. Scholars have long debated the logistics of their creation, how a small, isolated population could carve, transport, and erect hundreds of monumental statues with tools of stone and bone. Yet outside the realm of academia, more radical ideas have taken hold, weaving the island into a tapestry of myth, mystery, and imagination. Among these alternative theories, the notion of ancient advanced builders stands prominent. Some propose that a civilization far older than recorded history once flourished on Rapa Nui, possessing technologies lost to time. In this view, the Moai are not merely the labor of Polynesian ingenuity, but the remnants of a vanished people who understood physics, astronomy, and engineering in ways modern science has only begun to glimpse. Advocates point to the precision of the statue's construction and the alignment of certain platforms with celestial events as evidence, yet these claims often stretch beyond what archaeological evidence can confirm. Still, they endure, resonating with a human longing to bridge the gulf between ordinary history and extraordinary possibility. Other theorists suggest pre-Polynesian civilizations may have preceded the island's known settlers. In this scenario, the first inhabitants of Rapa Nui were not voyagers from the Marquesas or Tahiti, but an earlier, now lost wave of humans who carried their own myths and practices. Proponents note subtle variations in carving styles, shifts in ceremonial construction, and even traces of agricultural techniques that seem anomalous for the initial Polynesian settlers. Could it be that Rapa Nui was once part of a network of global cultures now erased by time? The notion is tantalizing, though. Like so many of these hypotheses, it remains tantalizingly unprovable. Perhaps the most ambitious idea is the suggestion of a lost global culture, a civilization whose influence stretched across oceans and continents, leaving only scattered monuments in its wake. Some theorists link Rapa Nui's moai to the megaliths of Malta, the pyramids of Egypt, and even the stone circles of South America, proposing a shared knowledge of stone, geometry, and ritual. Magnetic anomalies, subterranean tunnels, and legends of hidden chambers are cited as fragments of evidence for this ancient network. To the human mind, patterns demand explanation, and the mysterious placement and design of the moai invite the imagination to wander far beyond the island's shores. Yet beneath these extraordinary claims lies a common impulse, the desire to find continuity between myth and stone. Humans are storytellers, and monuments like the moai demand stories, where archaeology offers labor, logistics, and lineage. Imagination reaches for grandeur, for hidden wisdom, for civilizations lost not to the wind but to the collective memory of the world. It is a testament to the moai themselves, that their silent faces can bear both historical fact and the weight of human yearning. Some enthusiasts go further, tracing supposed subterranean networks beneath the island, tunnels linking platforms and ceremonial sites. They speak of chambers holding untold treasures, of chambers vibrating with geomagnetic energy, of alignments that echo celestial mechanics. Scientific surveys have yet to confirm these claims, though geophysical anomalies occasionally spark speculation. The allure is irresistible. The idea that beneath the earth lies a secret, a lost layer of civilization waiting to be rediscovered, a narrative hidden just out of reach of certainty. The persistence of these theories often says less about Rapa Nui than about the people who study it. In every corner of the world, we long for proof that our myths are more than stories, that they are records of an intelligence beyond ourselves. It is as though the moai, standing resolute and inscrutable, have become a mirror. Their silent gaze reflects our questions, our doubts, our hope that history is not merely a chronology of survival, but a tapestry threaded with wonder. Even the more fantastical claims, magnetic anomalies, cosmic alignments, extraterrestrial intervention, contain a kernel of truth about human perception. The moai are enormous. Their construction required coordination, ingenuity, and devotion over generations. To imagine otherwise is to confront the extraordinary capabilities of humans living in isolation, facing resource scarcity and environmental constraint. Perhaps the statue's mystery is magnified precisely because human determination, magnified over centuries, can seem indistinguishable from magic. Anthropologists and archaeologists remind us that Rapa Nui was never devoid of context. The Polynesian settlers brought with them a rich cosmology, social hierarchy, and knowledge of navigation, agriculture, and stonework. Oral histories, though fractured by disease and colonial suppression, recount the stories of chiefs, lineages, and the manner imbued in each moai. The island's isolation did not produce impossibility. It produced a concentrated, meticulous culture capable of monumental achievement without recourse to lost continents or alien intervention. yet fascination persists. The idea of lost civilizations, whether imagined in the minds of theorists or projected through the lens of ancient astronaut narratives, serves a deeper function. It is a form of humility, a recognition that the human story is broader, stranger, and more intricate than the neat lines of textbooks allow. Every radical theory, every imaginative leap, is a reminder that history is not merely to be studied, it is to be contemplated, to be inhabited by wonder. The Moai themselves, despite toppled bodies or weathered faces, resist definitive interpretation. Some gaze inland, others out to sea. Some stand isolated, others in clustered platforms. They are silent, yet their arrangement encodes something of social memory, something of ritualized care, something of belief. And because they are so quiet, they leave a vacuum in which both fact and fantasy can coexist in the end. The theories of lost civilizations illuminate as much about the human mind as they do about Rapa Nui. They ask us to suspend certainty, to consider that isolation can yield brilliance, and that devotion measured over centuries can leave impressions vast enough to bewilder generations. They remind us that monumental complexity does not require supernatural origin, it requires focus, community, and a deep engagement with the world over time. And still, the questions linger. Was there more than one wave of settlers on Rapa Nui? Were the Moai purely expressions of lineage and ritual, or do they encode knowledge we have yet to decipher? Did islands like this form nodes of broader prehistoric networks, connected in ways now lost beneath the waves and sands? Or is the human imagination, drawn to patterns and mystery, simply projecting narratives onto stone? Standing before the weathered faces of the Moai, one senses both the power of human achievement and the enduring weight of unanswered questions. The island is a monument not only to those who carved and transported these stones, but to the generations who have tried, and continue to try, to understand them. Every hypothesis, every theory, every whispered speculation adds another layer to the dialogue between stone and imagination. Rapa Nui remains a canvas for projection, a stage where human curiosity meets the permanence of rock. Perhaps the greatest lesson is one of humility, that the extraordinary can emerge from ordinary devotion, and that the past need not be miraculous to be magnificent. In the silence between the Moai, we hear the echo of human effort, magnified by isolation, time, and the unending impulse to remember. And as the sun sinks over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the stone platforms, one realizes that the ultimate mystery may not be the statues themselves, but our desire to see in them a world we have not yet fully comprehended. The island endures, the stone endures, and the questions endure with them, quiet, unyielding, eternal. The Moai remain, guardians of a story we may never entirely understand, and in their silence, they invite us to wonder. Chapter 22: Restoration and Preservation. The winds of Rapa Nui sweep across volcanic stone and coarse sand, carrying with them the echo of a past both visible and vanished. Here, the Moai stand, some towering, still upright, their shadows stretching across the plains. Others lie in silent defeat, toppled by centuries of storms, warfare, or human hands. Since the 1990s, efforts to restore these monuments have transformed the landscape once more, as archaeologists, local communities, and UNESCO painstakingly worked to lift statues from the ground, returning them to their ancient platforms. Yet each reconstructed Ahu is more than a physical structure. It is a gesture laden with questions about time, memory, and human intervention. Restoration began with careful study. Photographs, field notes, and early measurements guided teams in reassembling fractured statues. At sites like Ahu Tongariki, a monument of 15 Moai scattered by a tsunami in 1960, engineers and archaeologists spent years cataloging every stone, weighing each possibility of placement against the historical record. The process was meticulous, every fallen fragment examined, mapped, and documented before being lifted back onto its ceremonial platform. Modern cranes moved stones once hauled by human hands alone, bridging millennia with machinery and care. Yet with each restoration, a paradox emerges. In reviving what was lost, are we truly uncovering history, or shaping it anew through contemporary eyes? Every decision, how to align a Moai, how to reconstruct a headless torso, which stones to replace, which to leave in situ, carries the weight of interpretation. Archaeologists speak of restoration as narrative, acknowledging that the act of rebuilding is inevitably colored by modern assumptions, by the limits of our knowledge. To stand before a re-erected Moai is to confront not only the past, but our own projection of it. Ethics here are as solid as the basalt underfoot. The descendants of Rapa Nui's original builders, the Rapa Nui people, have increasingly asserted their voices in these projects. They ask not only how statues are restored, but who decides. Restoration is not merely technical, it is a negotiation of sovereignty, culture, and ancestral memory. When an Ahu is reassembled by outsiders, it is both homage and intrusion. The land is sacred. Each stone carries the mana of generations. To move it, even with reverence, is to touch the intangible, to engage with the spiritual as well as the archaeological. Tourism adds another layer of complexity. The island, small and isolated, now receives tens of thousands of visitors each year, all drawn to the Moai and the myths that swirl around them. Paths are carved into the earth, fences erected to guide human movement. While these measures protect the monuments, they also reshape the landscape, creating a tension between accessibility and preservation. Erosion, foot traffic, and coastal rising waters accelerated by climate change pose constant threats. The very air, salt-laden and humid, corrodes basalt surfaces. While storms chip at ceremonial platforms that have endured centuries, conservation here is not static. It is a race against time, weather, and human impact. Local communities play a central role in mediation. Workshops, cultural programs, and participatory restoration projects ensure that the Rapa Nui are not merely observers, but active stewards of their heritage. Young people learn to carve replicas of traditional tools, to measure angles and alignments, to understand the ceremonial significance of each moai. In this way, preservation becomes not only technical, but cultural, a bridge between past and present, teaching a new generation to honor history while negotiating the needs of a modern world. Yet, restoration also confronts us with the fragility of memory itself. Some statues have missing pieces, lost to erosion, collapse, or theft. Others were displaced in pre-modern conflicts or moved by explorers seeking souvenirs for distant museums. Reconstructing a moai is therefore never a simple act of lifting. It is an act of interpretation, of imagining what once was. Even the best documented sites require choices about which fragments to restore, how to orient them, and how to respect ritual alignment. Each decision carries weight. History is not merely revealed, it is co-created. Scientific methods have expanded the possibilities of preservation. 3D scanning, laser mapping, and drone surveys now allow archaeologists to record every contour of stone and earth. Digital models preserve data even as the physical monuments weather. Laboratory analysis of basalt and coral surfaces helps identify erosion patterns and informs protective treatments. Geologists and conservationists work alongside anthropologists and local elders, blending knowledge systems to care for a landscape that is both material and spiritual. And yet, despite technological advances, some questions resist resolution. How were the original moai transported, raised, and aligned? Were restoration choices faithful to ancestral intent, or do they reflect a contemporary reconstruction of sacred space? The moai, silent and inscrutable, do not answer. Their gaze directed toward inland villages, distant horizons, or celestial markers remains enigmatic. In attempting to preserve them, we confront the limits of understanding and the humility demanded by history. The tension between preservation and intrusion mirrors global debates in archaeology. Across continents, from Egyptian temples to Andean terraces, restoration raises similar questions. When is repair reverent? When is it reconstructive? On Rapa Nui, the stakes are heightened by the living culture of the island. The Rapa Nui people claim both heritage and land. The monuments are not relics, but anchors of identity. International interventions, no matter how well-intended, must reckon with this duality. To restore without respect is to override memory, yet to ignore threats is to invite irreversible loss. Climate change adds urgency. Rising seas, shifting weather patterns, and intensifying storms erode coastlines where moai stand sentinel. Salt crystallization in porous basalt threatens surface detail. Even stabilized statues require constant monitoring. Preventive conservation has become a routine necessity, blending traditional knowledge with modern science. This is preservation as vigilance, a continuous act of care against the impermanence of stone and the relentlessness of nature in parallel. The dialogue about tourism evolves. While visitors bring economic support, they also impose wear on sacred ground. Paths are reinforced, viewing platforms constructed, yet the human presence remains a pressure on the landscape. Archaeologists and Rapa Nui elders walk this line together, negotiating access and protection, education and experience. Preservation is never passive. It is an ongoing choreography between people, stones, and environment. The ethics of restoration extend beyond technique and logistics. They touch philosophy. What does it mean to reconstruct a past that cannot fully speak for itself? Are we reviving history, or composing a story from fragments, gaps, and modern assumptions? Each re-erected moai embodies both answers and questions. Standing among them, one feels the tension of time, the weight of what has survived, the absence of what cannot be recovered, and the responsibility carried by those who care for these monuments today. Despite centuries of erosion, collapse, and displacement, the moai endure. Their presence is a testament to ingenuity, devotion, and the human desire to leave a mark on the earth. Restoration, in all its complexity, allows the world to glimpse these ancient voices again, even as it reminds us that the past is never fully ours to command. Preservation is both homage and confrontation, a negotiation between reverence, interpretation, and ownership. As the sun sets over Rapa Nui, shadows stretch long across Ahu Construction, merging toppled and upright statues into a tapestry of memory. The ocean hums at the edge of the island, the wind stirring sand against basalt. Restoration has returned life to stone, yet the ultimate story remains unresolved. Each moai, each platform, is a question in itself, a witness to human endeavor. to loss, and to continuity. The act of preservation continues, daily, in careful hands and watchful eyes. And yet for all the cranes, surveys, and digital models, the Moai retain their silence. They do not tell us what is right, only what has endured. They ask us to consider our own role in the chain of time, to observe, to protect, and to reckon with the delicate boundary between memory and imagination. The monuments stand, both ancient and renewed, facing inland and horizon, watching over descendants and visitors alike, and beneath their quiet gaze, the island holds its secret questions of heritage, authenticity, and the unseen choices that shape the past anew. Time moves slowly here, and preservation is a dialogue that may never end. Chapter 23: The Voice of the Descendants in the Windswept Shores of Rapa Nui. Where the Pacific crashes against cliffs as it has for millennia, the Moai stand in patient vigil. Their carved faces, weathered by centuries of salt and storm, seem almost to listen, silently recording the passage of time. Yet their story is no longer only one of stone and shadow. The living heartbeat of the island now murmurs alongside them, soft, insistent, and unwavering. Modern Rapa Nui people, though few in number, carry the legacy of those who first sculpted these monumental figures. They are the keepers of language, ritual, and memory, striving to breathe life back into a culture that was nearly silenced. For decades, colonial authorities and missionary efforts sought to erase the past, supplanting the native tongue, suppressing traditional ceremonies, and dispersing communities across the globe. Oral traditions, once spoken in the quiet intimacy of village gatherings or beneath the shade of a sprawling Toromiro tree, were systematically muted. But the resilience of a people cannot be buried entirely. Even beneath waves of oppression in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a quiet revolution began. Scholars, anthropologists, and community leaders worked alongside local elders to record stories that had survived in whispers. Children were taught the Rapa Nui language once more. Chants that echoed the rhythms of ancient work songs were restored, and dances tied to seasonal cycles and ancestral homage were revived. These are not mere performances. They are acts of reclamation, gestures that reassert the presence of a living culture amid the ruins of its past. The Moai themselves, long treated as archaeological artifacts, have been embraced as more than relics. They are teachers, witnesses, and guides. In festivals and ceremonies, the islanders gather before the statues, honoring their ancestors, asking for guidance, and offering gratitude. In these moments, the stones cease to be silent monuments. They become participants in a dialogue spanning centuries. Oral histories explain that the Moai contain the mana, the spiritual energy of those they represent. To face them is not to confront the dead, but to commune with memory itself. Archaeology, for all its rigor, often overlooks this dimension. Excavation reports describe weight, material, and orientation, while carbon dating measures centuries with clinical precision. Yet beneath the sand, under layers of scientific observation, lies a truth that cannot be quantified. The emotional and cultural resonance of the Moai belongs first to the descendants of Rapa Nui. Every crack in the volcanic tuff, every lichen-streaked face, is intertwined with human experience, loss, and resilience. Modern revitalization efforts are more than symbolic. Land rights campaigns, for instance, have sought to return portions of the island to the Rapa Nui community, allowing them to manage sacred sites, regulate tourism, and care for their heritage on their own terms. The reclamation of land is inseparable from the reclamation of culture. Without the physical spaces where history unfolded, language and ritual risk becoming abstract, detached from the geography that nurtured them. Yet, in recent decades, incremental victories have enabled communities to rebuild both presence and agency. Education has become a pivotal arena for cultural survival. Local schools teach Rapa Nui language alongside Spanish, embedding oral histories into curricula. Children learn to carve Moai replicas in clay, understanding not only the technical skills but the ceremonial and familial significance of the practice. Storytelling circles reconnect younger generations with elders, ensuring that songs, myths, and genealogies continue to resonate. These efforts are more than preservation, they are active participation in a living continuum of identity. Tourism, once a force of commodification, has been reframed in partnership with the community. Guided visits to ceremonial platforms, or Ahu, now include explanations by Rapa Nui themselves, offering insight into the spiritual as well as historical dimensions of the Moai. Visitors witness not only the monumental artistry but also the ongoing conversation between stone and people, past and present. By asserting authority over their own narratives, the descendants of the island reclaim the framing of history itself. Even in the quietest corners of the island, the presence of revival is felt. Fields once left fallow are being cultivated with traditional crops. Ceremonial spaces are cleared of debris, paths to ancient quarries retraced, and sacred caves revisited. Every act, however small, contributes to a reweaving of cultural memory. A reaffirmation that these practices are not lost, they were waiting, patient, like seeds beneath the desert. The act of recording oral traditions is itself transformative. Stories once carried only in spoken word are now archived, translated, and preserved, yet they remain living, meant to be spoken aloud, sung, and performed. They recount not only historical events but spiritual understandings, instructions for social cohesion, and guidance for interacting with a landscape. They provide context for the Moai, explaining why they face inland or seaward, why some were toppled and left in repose, and why certain platforms were chosen over others. This resurgence also challenges the way the world views Rapa Nui for centuries. Outsiders cast the Moai as enigmatic, almost alien artifacts, divorced from the people who created them. Today, the narrative shifts. The Moai are no longer isolated symbols of mystery. They are inseparable from memory, from identity, and from a community's ongoing dialogue with its ancestors. Archaeologists, historians, and visitors alike are compelled to consider not only the physical achievements but the human lives that shaped them, the networks of meaning that rendered them alive. In the 21st century, the Rapa Nui embrace a dual responsibility to honor the ancestors and to navigate a globalized present. Climate change, tourism pressures, and environmental degradation threaten both land and heritage. Yet, the descendants approach these challenges not as passive inheritors but as active custodians. They teach that cultural survival requires adaptation without severing the connection to memory, that the Moai are as much guides for the future as records of the past. It is here, in this interplay of loss, reclamation, and hope, that the island's deeper truth emerges. The Moai do not belong to mystery alone, nor to scholars or tourists. They belong first to the people whose blood, song, and labor shaped them. Beneath the careful measurements, carbon dates, and excavation trenches lies an emotional reality. These stones are living repositories of community, devotion, and continuity. In quiet evenings, when the winds slow and the Pacific laps the volcanic cliffs with gentle persistence, one can see the islanders walking among the Moai, speaking to them softly, laying offerings, singing old chants. Their voices carry the weight of centuries, yet are fresh with life, affirming that memory is not frozen but fluid. Every chant, every ritual gesture, reconnects present to past, human to stone, living to ancestral. And in these moments, it becomes clear that the future of Rapa Nui may depend less on archaeology or global recognition than on the willingness of its descendants to listen. To honor the past is not merely to study it, it is to converse with it, to allow its presence to guide contemporary life, and to recognize that culture is not simply a matter of preservation, but of ongoing participation. The Moai remain steadfast, silent in form, but resonant in spirit, and the descendants, in reclaiming language, ritual, and land, speak through them. A dialogue stretches across centuries, sometimes fractured, sometimes renewed, always alive, in the quiet communion of wind, stone, and song. The voice of Rapa Nui whispers insistently, memory cannot be stolen, and identity cannot be erased. The island teaches that heritage is not only what is carved in stone but what is carried in hearts, spoken aloud, and lived daily. Each chant, each ceremony, each reclaimed path is a step in reclaiming not just history, but the authority to define it. And as the Moai look on, patient and immovable, one is left with the sense that the stones themselves are listening, waiting, and perhaps even guiding the journey of those who remember. In the end, archaeology can reveal form, dates, and technique, but it cannot capture the full resonance of culture that lives in the people. It lives in their language, their chants, their rituals, their choices, and it waits to be heard, again and again, beneath the gaze of the Moai. Chapter 24: The Enduring Enigma. Who really built them? On the remote wind-scoured island of Rapa Nui, the Moai stand as sentinels of a forgotten time. Their bodies, carved from volcanic tuff, rise from the earth like immovable guardians, faces etched with solemnity, their backs rigid against the Pacific wind. For centuries, travelers, historians, and adventurers have asked the same question: who built them? The answer seems simple. Archaeology, linguistics, and oral tradition converge to name the builders the Polynesians of Rapa Nui, people who navigated vast distances across the Pacific, carrying with them seeds, tools, and a profound understanding of the ocean. Yet to stop there is to miss the deeper mystery, the enigma that has persisted despite centuries of scholarship and fieldwork. For the Moai are not merely objects of labor, they are vessels of intention, symbols of belief, and manifestations of a civilization's desire to endure beyond memory. The people of Rapa Nui, arriving on the island perhaps as early as 1200 CE, transformed an isolated land into a thriving society. They felled the island's forests to construct platforms, houses, and roads. They carved the Moai, some towering more than 10 meters high, from the slopes of the Raraku quarry, where volcanic tuff provided workable stone. Each statue was hewn with care, a portrait of an ancestor, a spiritual beacon intended to safeguard the living. Archaeologists have documented the methods of transport: timber rollers, sledges, and ingenious rope systems, but the debate remains vivid. How could a people, lacking large draft animals or metal tools, maneuver hundreds of tons of stone across the uneven terrain of a volcanic island? Experiments in recent decades suggest techniques, yet none capture the full measure of what it took: the collective will, the synchronized effort, the ritualized knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. More elusive than the mechanics is the question of intent. Why were these figures built? Theories abound, but none fully satisfy. Some suggest devotion, an attempt to honor ancestors whose wisdom guided the living. Others see competition, rival clans seeking prestige through size, number, or placement of statues. Still others propose a more subtle vision, the desire to anchor the divine in stone, to make a permanent claim on the intangible, to transform memory into matter. Whatever the reason, it is evident that each moai required not only labor but ceremony, not only design but belief. The eyes of the ancestors once inlaid with coral were meant to open in ritual, to awaken the stone and make it witness. Without ritual, the stone remained inert, a silent presence. This interplay of devotion and labor is crucial to understanding the enduring enigma. The moai are not puzzles in the conventional sense. They are reflections of human consciousness grappling with in an environment as isolated and unpredictable as Rapa Nui. A society that could anchor its ancestors in monumental stone was asserting a form of permanence, a defiance against the ephemeral nature of life, a declaration that memory could be made material. And yet, permanence is fragile. Within centuries, forests vanished, soils eroded, and conflict grew. Many moai were toppled, their eyes removed, their sacred presence disrupted. The same wind that shaped their stone features would eventually erode their very foundation. Archaeological evidence suggests that the act of statue toppling may have been intertwined with social upheaval. Oral tradition and ethnohistorical records tell of clan rivalries, resource scarcity, and spiritual recalibration. As populations strained against the limits of the island's ecology, the statues once central to social cohesion became instruments in disputes over power and belief. Yet even in destruction, there is reverence. The toppling of a moai may have been a form of ritual closure, an attempt to quiet a spirit whose presence was no longer sustainable in the world of the living. In this sense, destruction and creation are inseparable, each gesture echoing with intent, each movement imbued with meaning. That the scale of ambition required to build the moai is staggering. Some scholars have calculated that constructing and erecting the nearly 900 statues that originally dotted the island would have demanded coordinated labor, planning, and engineering skills over centuries. The largest, known as Paro, weighs over 80 tons. Transporting it from Raraku to the ceremonial platforms along the coast is a feat that still inspires wonder. Yet numbers alone fail to capture the spiritual dimension, the reason the moai were made at all. For Rapa Nui society, the statues were not trophies or markers of wealth, they were living embodiments of ancestors' gaze, mediators between human and divine, between past and present. This is where the enigma deepens. We know who carved the stone, where they quarried it, how they transported it, and even, in part, how they raised it. But the underlying impulse, the why, remains beyond certainty. Why devote decades of labor to a solitary monument in a landscape that can barely sustain life? Why risk forests and soil, the ecological foundation of survival, to erect eyes in volcanic stone? Perhaps the answer lies not in logic, but in psychology. The moai are mirrors, not just of the ancestors, but of human aspiration itself, the need to project meaning, to transcend mortality, to leave something enduring where the world might otherwise forget. Ethnographies studying Polynesian belief systems offer insight, though never closure. In the cosmology of Rapa Nui, the past and present were inseparable, and the ancestor was always present, guiding life, regulating fertility, and mediating the unseen forces that governed daily existence. The moai, then, were not monuments, they were nodes in a living network of spiritual practice, territorial identity, and social negotiation. To the builders, erecting stone was less an act of display than an act of dialogue, a conversation between the living and the dead, between earth and sky, between necessity and transcendence. And yet, centuries later, the statues remain silent. No chant animates them now. No coral eyes gleam in their sockets. Time has quieted their presence. Storms and erosion have softened their features, and the slow advance of grass, soil, and wind threatens to reclaim them entirely. Still, the moai endure, and in their endurance, they continue to pose the question that has haunted observers for generations: who built them? Not merely who placed the stone, but who imagined it awake, who shaped devotion into granite, who reached across centuries to speak to the future. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, restoration efforts have attempted to return some moai to their platforms, upright and gazing inland once more. Even then, there is a sense of impermanence. The restored statues are fragile testaments to human effort and memory. They stand as both achievement and warning, proof of what can be accomplished, and a reminder of how easily such achievements can be forgotten, toppled, or misunderstood. The wind sweeps across their ancient faces, carrying the echo of hands that once carved them, eyes that once watched through coral inlays, voices that once sang their activation ceremonies. And still, the question persists. It persists quietly, reverently, like a pulse beneath the rock. Who really built the giants of Easter Island? The Polynesians, certainly, But beyond the certainty of attribution lies something more elusive, a mystery of intent, of belief, of the human drive to leave a mark that will endure beyond the lifespan of the flesh. It is a question that cannot be answered fully by archaeology, anthropology, or oral tradition. It is a question that lives in the space between stone and spirit, between the wind and the gaze of the statues themselves. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Moai were never meant to be solved. They were meant to endure, to witness, to remind those who come after that some creations belong less to the world of explanation than to the realm of awe. And so they remain, silent and monumental, shadows cast over the volcanic slopes, eyes closed and waiting, the stone that remembers what we have forgotten, guardians of a question that has no final answer. The Pacific wind passes over their shoulders, ruffles the grass at their feet, and carries with it the memory of chants long silenced. The Moai endure, and as they endure, so does the enigma, pressing forward across centuries, inviting those who walk among them to pause, to wonder, and to ask once more who really built them. And in that question, perhaps, lies the true monument, less stone than human imagination, less permanence than the eternal pull of curiosity.